The banker turned his back the moment he saw her shoes, torn, muddy, exposing bleeding toes. They told the story of a desperate journey no refined gentleman wanted to claim. Evelyn Hart had crossed 1,000 miles for a promise written in ink, only to be abandoned on a dusty platform while the whole town watched. But a cowboy saw something different in those ruined shoes. Courage that couldn't be bought. Stay with me until the end, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The autumn wind carried the smell of coal smoke and dying grass across Red Willow Station, Montana. It was the kind of wind that got inside your bones and reminded you that winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. The afternoon train from Chicago wheezed to a stop with a screech of iron on iron, steam billowing from beneath its massive black wheels like the breath of some exhausted beast. Evelyn Hart stepped down onto the wooden platform, and the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She had been traveling for 6 days. 6 days of hard wooden seats, stale bread, and the constant rocking motion that made her stomach turn. 6 days of watching America roll past her window. First the crowded tenements of Chicago, then the endless fields of Iowa, then the vast emptiness of the Dakota Territory, and finally these mountains, purple and imposing against a sky so big it made her feel like an insect. She clutched her cracked leather suitcase in one hand, the handle wrapped with twine to keep it from falling apart completely. In her other hand, she held the letter, the one she had read so many times the creases had worn thin and threatened to tear. My dearest Evelyn, I await your arrival with the greatest anticipation. Red Willow is a place of opportunity, and I believe we shall make a fine life together. I have secured a comfortable position at the bank, and my prospects are most promising. You need only bring yourself and your courage. Yours in earnest affection, Edward Lang. The words had seemed so beautiful when she'd first received them 3 months ago in the cramped boarding house room she shared with 3 other seamstresses in Chicago. Edward's letters had been her escape during those long nights when her fingers bled from pushing needles through thick fabric, when the foreman shouted and the other girls cried, when the city pressed in on all sides with its noise and smoke and endless grinding poverty. He had seemed like a dream, a banker, an educated man, someone who wrote about books and music and the beauty of the Montana sky, someone who saw her as more than just another pair of hands to feed into the industrial machine. But now, standing on this platform with dust settling on her already filthy dress, Evelyn felt the first cold finger of doubt trace down her spine. She looked down at her shoes. They were completely ruined. The sole of the left one had torn away almost entirely, flapping with each step like a loose tongue. The right one had split across the toe, exposing her stockings, which were themselves more whole than fabric, and the raw, blistered skin beneath. Blood had dried in dark streaks across the cracked leather. She had walked 8 miles to reach the Chicago station, unable to afford the streetcar fare. Then she'd stood for hours during a layover in Omaha when there were no seats available. Then she'd had to run, actually run, to catch her connection in Billings when the schedule changed without warning. The shoes hadn't survived the journey, and looking at them now, standing in the clean afternoon light of this frontier town, Evelyn realized she looked like exactly what she was, a desperate woman with nothing. Evelyn? Evelyn Hart? The voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of impatience. She looked up sharply, her heart leaping. He was standing near the station house, 30 feet away. Edward Lang. She recognized him from the small photographic portrait he'd included with his 3rd letter. Handsome features, dark hair parted precisely in the middle, a well-trimmed mustache. But the photograph hadn't captured the coldness in his eyes. He was dressed impeccably, a dark suit with a silk vest, polished boots that gleamed even in the dust, a gold watch chain visible across his chest. Everything about him spoke of success, of belonging, of being exactly the kind of man who would never understand what it meant to walk until your feet bled. "Yes!" Evelyn called out, her voice cracking with relief and exhaustion. She took a step toward him, then another, acutely aware of how she must look, her dress stained with coal dust and sweat, her hair falling out of its pins, her face probably smudged with grime. "Yes, I'm Evelyn. I'm so sorry I looked such a fright. The journey was—" She saw it happen in slow motion. His gaze traveled down from her face to her dress, taking in every patch and stain. then lower to her hands with their reddened, work-worn knuckles clutching that pathetic suitcase, and finally to her feet, to those destroyed shoes with their flapping soles and exposed toes. Something shifted in his expression. The polite smile froze, then died completely. His eyes went flat and distant, the way a shopkeeper's eyes go flat when a beggar walks in. "Mr. Lang?" she said uncertainly. "It's me. It's Evelyn." For a long moment he said nothing. Around them, the platform was busy with activity, passengers disembarking, porters hauling trunks, families greeting arrivals. But in the space between Evelyn and Edward, there was only silence. Then he turned away. "Wait!" The word tore out of her throat. She took 3 stumbling steps forward, her suitcase banging against her leg. "Wait, please, I've come all this way." But Edward Lang was already walking, his polished boots clicking efficiently across the wooden planks. He moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged, someone who knew exactly where he was going and had every right to be there. Within seconds, he had disappeared around the corner of the station house. Evelyn stood frozen, her arms still outstretched, her mouth still open on words that would never be heard. Then the whispers started. "Did you see that? Poor thing. Can you imagine coming all this way? Well, look at her. What did she expect? Those shoes. My God, those shoes. Edward Lang's mail-order bride, I heard. Was his mail-order bride. Doesn't look like he's claiming her now." The voices swirled around her like smoke, each one a small cut. Evelyn felt her face burning. The platform seemed to expand and contract with each heartbeat, the faces of strangers pressing closer, their eyes full of pity and judgment, and that particular kind of curiosity that people reserve for watching someone else's humiliation. Her legs gave out. She didn't mean to fall. One moment she was standing, and the next she was on her knees on the dusty platform, her suitcase toppling over beside her. The latch, already weakened from the journey, gave way, and the contents spilled out across the weathered wood. One dress, gray and carefully folded. A worn Bible that had been her mother's. 2 brass buttons wrapped in a scrap of cloth. A tin cup. A bone comb with 3 teeth missing, and a daguerreotype in a cheap wooden frame, showing a young couple on their wedding day, her parents, dead now these 5 years. That was everything. Everything she owned in the world laid out for all of Red Willow to see. The letter fell from her hand and the wind caught it, sending it skittering across the platform. Evelyn watched it go with distant, shocked eyes. What did it matter now? What did any of those beautiful words matter when the man who'd written them couldn't even bear to look at her? She heard someone laugh, a quick, embarrassed sound that was quickly stifled, heard the whispers intensify, felt the weight of dozens of eyes, taking in every detail of her poverty, her desperation, her complete and utter failure. I should never have come, she thought numbly. I should have stayed in Chicago. At least there I knew how to survive. At least there I belonged somewhere, even if it was only in a boarding house full of other broken girls. The tears came then, hot and shameful, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She bent forward, her forehead nearly touching the platform, and let herself cry. What else was there to do? She had no money for a return ticket, no place to stay, no one who would claim her. She was 1,000 miles from anything familiar, wearing ruined shoes and a dress that marked her as poor white trash, and she was completely, utterly alone. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, the novelty wearing off. The train would be leaving soon for Spokane. Life would go on. In a few hours, she would just be a story they told over dinner. Did you hear about Edward Lang's mail-order bride? The one with the torn shoes? Miss? The voice was different from the others, deeper, quieter, not unkind. Evelyn didn't look up. She couldn't bear to see another face full of pity or contempt. Miss, you dropped this. There was a soft sound, the letter being set down beside her. Then footsteps, moving away. But they stopped after a few paces. What's your name? This time she did look up, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. The man standing a few feet away was unlike anyone she had ever seen. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a frame that spoke of hard physical labor. His clothes were simple, worn denim trousers, a faded blue work shirt, a leather vest that had seen better days. Dust covered him from his scuffed boots to the brim of his wide hat. His face was tanned and weathered with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too many sunrises. He looked like he was made from the same material as the land itself, tough, enduring, honest. And he was looking at her not with pity, but with something else. Recognition, maybe. Or understanding. "Evelyn," she managed to whisper. "Evelyn Hart." He was silent for a moment, his eyes moving from her face to the scattered contents of her suitcase, to her destroyed shoes, and back to her face again. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "I'm Cole Archer." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed natural, not mocking. "I work a small ranch about 8 miles north of town." Evelyn said nothing. She didn't understand why he was talking to her, what he wanted. Men like him didn't speak to women like her, not in situations like this. Cole seemed to understand her confusion. He glanced around at the nearly empty platform, then back at her. "That fella who left you standing here, he's a damn fool." The words were said quietly, without heat, but they hit Evelyn like a physical blow. Fresh tears spilled over. "My shoes," she said, the words catching in her throat. "He saw my shoes and he—" "I saw your shoes too," Cole interrupted gently. He took a step closer, then crouched down so he was at her eye level. Up close, she could see that his eyes were gray-blue, like storm clouds. "Want to know what they told me?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "They told me you've walked a long way, that you're tougher than you look, that you didn't give up even when you should have." He reached out and picked up one of the brass buttons that had fallen from her suitcase, turning it over in his calloused palm. "These mean something to you?" "They were my father's," she whispered. "From his army uniform. It's all I have left of him." Cole nodded slowly, understanding passing across his face. He carefully placed the button back on the pile of her belongings, then stood up. For a long moment, he looked down at her, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Hart," he said finally, "do you have anywhere to go?" The question was asked kindly, but it still felt like a knife. Evelyn shook her head mutely. "Do you have any money?" Another shake. Cole was quiet again, and Evelyn felt a new kind of desperation creeping in. He was going to leave too. Of course he was. Why would he stay? Why would anyone help a woman who couldn't even manage to keep her shoes intact? But instead of walking away, Cole looked toward the station house, then toward the dirt road that led into town, then back at her. She could almost see him thinking, weighing options, making some kind of decision. "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. Then louder, "All right, here's what's going to happen. You're going to collect your things and put them back in your case. I'm going to go get my horse. And then you're going to come with me." Evelyn's head snapped up. "What?" "My ranch. You're going to come to my ranch. I can't." She struggled to find words. "I don't even know you. You don't know me. I couldn't possibly impose—" "It's not imposing if I'm offering." Cole's voice was firm, but not harsh. "You need somewhere to stay. I have somewhere. It's that simple." "But people will talk. They'll say—" She felt her face flush even deeper. "They'll think—" "Let them think whatever they want." There was something fierce in his eyes now, something that suggested he'd dealt with gossip before and survived it. "You can have the cabin. I'll sleep in the barn. Everything proper and respectable. You'll work if you want to, or you can just rest until you figure out what comes next. But you're not staying here, and you're sure as hell not sleeping in the street tonight." The words tumbled over her, too many to process. Part of her wanted to refuse, to hold on to some last shred of pride. But another part, the part that was cold and exhausted, and so tired of pretending to be strong, wanted nothing more than to say yes. "Why?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why would you help me?" Cole looked at her for a long moment, and something flickered across his face, something old and painful that was quickly hidden. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Because somebody should have, and nobody did." Before she could respond, he turned and walked toward the freight area where the horses were tied. Evelyn watched him go, her mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. Men like Cole Archer didn't rescue women like her. That wasn't how the world worked. And yet, she looked down at her scattered belongings, at the letter that had brought her here, now covered in dust and horse droppings, at her ridiculous, humiliating, utterly destroyed shoes. Edward Lang had looked at those shoes and seen failure, seen someone not worth the trouble, seen trash. But Cole Archer had looked at the same shoes and seen, what had he said? Toughness. Someone who hadn't given up. Maybe he was crazy. Maybe this whole thing was a terrible idea. Maybe she'd end up murdered in a ditch somewhere, and they'd shake their heads and say she should have known better than to trust a strange cowboy. But what other choice did she have? Moving slowly, mechanically, Evelyn began gathering her possessions. She folded the gray dress carefully, placed the Bible on top, wrapped the buttons back in their cloth. She picked up the daguerreotype and stared at her parents' young faces for a moment, wondering what they would think of her now. Her mother had always said that pride was the last thing you could afford to lose. But what was pride worth when you were alone and frightened in a strange town? The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Cole was leading a large bay horse, its coat dusty but its eyes bright and intelligent. Tied behind the saddle was a worn canvas bedroll and what looked like a rifle in a leather scabbard. He stopped in front of her, and she saw that he'd filled a canteen at the station pump. He held it out to her without a word. Evelyn took it with trembling hands and drank. The water was cold and sweet, the best thing she'd tasted in days. She hadn't realized how thirsty she was. "Thank you," she managed. Cole just nodded. Then he bent down and before she could protest, picked up her suitcase. He tested the broken latch, frowned, then pulled a length of rope from his saddlebag and secured it shut. "There," he said, tying it efficiently. "That'll hold." He attached the suitcase to the saddle, then turned to her. "Can you ride?" Evelyn looked at the horse, which seemed impossibly tall. "I've never... That is, in Chicago, we didn't..." "All right. You'll ride up front. I'll ride behind and keep you steady. It's about 8 miles and the sun's already getting low, so we should get moving." He said it so matter-of-factly, as if this were the most normal thing in the world, as if strange cowboys picked up abandoned women from train stations every day of the week. Maybe in Montana they did. What did Evelyn know? Cole led the horse to the edge of the platform, where the height difference was less dramatic. He mounted first, settling into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd spent half his life on horseback, then reached down to her. "Give me your hand." Evelyn hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of how close they would be, how improper this would look to anyone watching. But then she looked past him, toward the town of Red Willow spreading out in the afternoon sun, a place where she knew no one, where she had already been rejected and humiliated, where the only thing waiting for her was more whispers and pitying looks. She took his hand. His grip was strong and calloused, and he pulled her up with surprising ease. For a confused moment, she didn't know where to sit or how to position herself, but then his arm came around her waist, steadying her, and she found herself seated side saddle in front of him, her back against his chest. "Comfortable?" His voice was close to her ear, low and careful. She was about as far from comfortable as it was possible to be. Her heart was racing, her face was burning, and she was intensely aware of every point of contact between their bodies. But she also felt, for the first time in days, something like safe. "Yes," she lied. "Hold on to the saddle horn. I won't let you fall." And then they were moving, the horse's gait smooth and steady beneath them. Evelyn gripped the saddle horn with both hands, her knuckles white, as they rode past the last few stragglers on the platform. She saw their faces turn to watch, saw the surprise and speculation in their eyes. Let them look. Let them talk. What did it matter now? As they left the station behind and rode through the edge of Red Willow, Evelyn got her first real look at the town. It was bigger than she'd expected, maybe 24 buildings lining a wide main street. There was a general store, a hotel, a livery stable, a church with a white steeple, and of course the bank, where Edward Lang probably sat right now at his polished desk, already forgetting she'd ever existed. A few people stopped to stare as they passed. Evelyn saw a woman in a fine dress clutch her companion's arm and whisper something. Saw a man in front of the saloon pause mid-drink to watch them ride by. Saw children point and giggle. She wanted to disappear. wanted to melt into nothing, but Cole's arm remained steady around her waist, and his voice, when he spoke, was calm. Ignore them. They'll have something new to gossip about by next week. I'm sorry, Evelyn said miserably. I'm sorry you're being seen with me like this. They'll think, let them. The words were said with such finality that Evelyn fell silent. They rode on. Once they cleared the last house, the landscape opened up into rolling grassland dotted with scrub and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. The sun was lower now, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The air smelled different here than in Chicago, cleaner, bigger somehow, carrying the scent of sage and wild grasses. Despite everything, Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. The endless sky, the wide open space, it was terrifying and beautiful at the same time. First time out west? Cole asked after a while. Yes. I grew up in Philadelphia, then Chicago. Cities. Yes. This must be different. Very. They fell into silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The horse's hooves made a steady rhythm against the packed earth. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, a sound Eveline didn't recognize. Your father was a soldier, Cole said eventually. It wasn't a question. Yes, he fought in the war. Came home sick and never really recovered. He died when I was 15. And your mother? 2 years later, pneumonia. The old grief was still there, but dulled now by time and distance. After that, I went to Chicago to work in the garment factories. There were other girls from Philadelphia there, so I thought I'd have friends, a place to belong. Did you? Evelyn thought about the crowded boarding house, the endless shifts at the factory, the bone-deep exhaustion that never quite went away. No, not really. It was just existing, getting through one day to get to the next. When Edward's first letter came, I thought... She trailed off, embarrassed. You thought he was offering something better. I thought he was offering a life. The admission hurt. I thought maybe I could be something other than just hands at a sewing machine. Maybe I could have a home, a family. Maybe I could matter to someone. Cole didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quiet. You matter. Just because one fool couldn't see it doesn't change that. The words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unexpected. Evelyn blinked hard against fresh tears. They rode on as the sun sank lower. The land began to change, becoming more varied, gentle hills, scattered rock formations, small creeks cutting silver paths through the grass. Cole guided the horse with easy confidence, clearly knowing the terrain by heart. Eventually, he spoke again. I should tell you what you're getting into. The ranch isn't much, just me and about 30 head of cattle. There's a cabin, one room, but solid. The barn's in good shape. There's a creek for water. I grow some vegetables, hunt for meat. It's simple living. It sounds wonderful, Evelyn said, and meant it. Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh. Wait till you see it before you say that. And I should tell you, he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I'm not looking for a wife or anything like that. I'm offering you a place to stay until you figure out your next move, that's all. I want to be clear about that. I understand. Evelyn felt her face grow hot again. I don't expect... Good. Because people in town are going to assume things no matter what the truth is. I just want to make sure we're both clear on the situation. We are. And Mr. Archer, thank you. You didn't have to help me, and you did. I won't forget that. Cole, he said. Just Cole. Cole. The name felt strange in her mouth, too familiar, too intimate, but also somehow right. They crested a hill, and Cole pulled the horse to a stop. There, he said, pointing. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley where a line of cottonwood trees marked the path of a creek, was the ranch. The cabin was small but well built, with a stone chimney and a narrow porch. The barn stood nearby, its weathered wood silver in the fading light. Beyond them, she could see a corral, and in the distance, cattle grazing on the hillside. It wasn't much. By the standards of Edward Lang's bank, it probably looked like poverty. But to Evelyn, who had spent the last few years in cramped rooms and sooty factories, who had just been abandoned on a train platform like unwanted luggage, it looked like the most beautiful place she had ever seen. It's perfect, she whispered. Cole didn't reply, but she felt him relax slightly behind her, as if he'd been worried about her reaction. They rode down into the valley as the last light faded from the sky. By the time they reached the cabin, stars were beginning to appear overhead. More stars than Evelyn had ever seen in her life, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. Cole dismounted first, then helped her down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. She'd been tensed in the saddle for so long that her muscles had cramped. Cole steadied her with a hand on her elbow until she found her balance. "You all right?" "Yes, just stiff." He nodded and began unsaddling the horse. Evelyn stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with herself. Her feet hurt terribly, and she could feel blood seeping through what remained of her stockings. Cole noticed. Of course he noticed. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the porch steps. It wasn't a request. Evelyn sat, and Cole finished with the horse, leading it to the corral and giving it some hay. Then he disappeared into the barn and emerged a moment later with a bucket and what looked like a medical kit. He went to the creek, filled the bucket with water, and brought it back to where she sat. Then, without a word, he knelt in front of her. "May I?" he asked, indicating her ruined shoes. Evelyn wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him she could manage herself, but the truth was she couldn't. She nodded mutely. Cole carefully removed what was left of her shoes and peeled away the tattered stockings. In the moonlight, her feet looked terrible, blistered, bleeding, swollen. She heard his sharp intake of breath. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," he muttered. "How long have they been like this?" "A few days," she admitted. "It got worse when the sole came off outside Billings." "And you just kept walking?" It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "What else could I do?" Cole didn't respond. Instead, he dipped a cloth in the cold water and began very gently cleaning the blood and dirt from her feet. His touch was careful, methodical, the touch of someone who'd tended injuries before. When she flinched, he paused but didn't stop. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" "For being weak, for crying at the station, for needing help, for—" "Stop." Cole looked up at her, and in the moonlight his eyes were dark and serious. "Listen to me, Evelyn Hart. You walked until your feet bled. You traveled 1,000 miles alone. You stood on that platform and took the worst kind of humiliation without falling apart. You are not weak. You are the strongest damn person I've met in a long time." The tears came again, but this time they were different. Not tears of shame or despair, but something else, something that felt almost like hope. Cole finished cleaning her feet, then applied some kind of salve from the medical kit and wrapped them in clean bandages with practiced efficiency. "There," he said, sitting back. "That'll do for tonight. In the morning, I'll see if I can find you some proper boots. Mine'll be too big, but they're better than nothing." He stood up and helped her to her feet, her newly bandaged, still painful feet. "Can you walk?" "I think so." He led her to the cabin door and pushed it open. Inside was dark, but he lit a lantern, and warm light filled the single room. It was simple but clean. A narrow bed with a patched quilt, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, shelves with a few dishes and supplies, a trunk at the foot of the bed, one window with faded curtains. "It's not much," Cole said again. "It's wonderful," Evelyn said, and she meant it with her whole heart. Cole set her suitcase on the table. "There's water in the pitcher, extra blankets in the trunk if you get cold. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He moved toward the door, but Evelyn called out. "Cole?" He turned back. "Why did you really help me? Please, I need to understand." For a long moment, he was silent, backlit by the moonlight from the open door. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "Because 5 years ago, I watched my sister get off a train in Denver. She'd traveled from Kentucky to marry a mine foreman who'd sent for her. He took one look at her country dress and her rough hands and decided she wasn't good enough for him. Just walked away and left her standing there." He paused, and Evelyn could hear the old pain in his voice. She had nowhere to go, no money, no one to help her. By the time I found out and got there, she'd been, well, let's just say there are worse things than sleeping in the street, and she found them. "Cole, I'm so sorry." "She's all right now," he continued. Married to a good man in California, has 2 kids. But I never forgot what it looked like, seeing her standing there alone, watching that man walk away. And when I saw you on that platform today," he trailed off, then shook his head. "I couldn't walk away. Not again." Evelyn felt something break open in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not walking away." Cole nodded once, tipped his hat, and left, closing the door quietly behind him. Alone in the cabin, Evelyn stood for a long moment, trying to process everything that had happened. 12 hours ago, she'd been on a train, full of nervous hope about meeting Edward Lang. Now she was in a stranger's cabin in the middle of the Montana prairie, her feet wrapped in bandages, her future completely uncertain. But somehow, impossibly, she felt safer than she had in years. She limped to the bed and sat down, then finally, let herself cry properly. Not the desperate, broken crying from the train platform, but something cleaner. Grief for the dreams that had died today, relief that someone had seen her worth when it mattered most, and something else, something she couldn't quite name yet. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the night prairie, crickets, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle. And somewhere out there, in the barn, a cowboy who had looked at her torn shoes and seen not failure, but courage. Evelyn lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, and stared at the rough wooden ceiling. Tomorrow she would have to figure out what came next. Tomorrow she would have to face the reality of her situation, make plans, decide on a future. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't alone. And that, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, was enough. Outside, Cole Archer stood in the barn doorway, looking at the lit window of his cabin. He'd meant what he said. He wasn't looking for a wife, wasn't looking for complications. He'd learned the hard way that the ranching life was solitary, and that was just how it had to be. But there was something about Evelyn Hart that had gotten under his skin. The way she'd looked up at him with those tear-filled eyes, the way she'd kept apologizing for things that weren't her fault, the way she'd walked 1,000 miles on bleeding feet because she'd believed in someone's promise. He'd seen a lot of hardness in this world, a lot of cruelty, a lot of people who would step on someone else just to get ahead. But he'd also seen what it looked like when someone refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. He'd seen it in his sister, eventually. He'd seen it in himself after his parents died and he'd had to build this place from nothing. And he'd seen it today in a young woman with torn shoes who'd traveled across a continent for a dream that turned to dust. Cole turned and walked deeper into the barn, spreading his bedroll in the hay. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The ranch didn't run itself, and he still had cattle to check on, fences to mend, 100 other tasks. But tonight, he went to sleep knowing he'd done the right thing. And in the cabin, Evelyn Hart slept her first dreamless sleep in years, wrapped in a stranger's kindness and the possibility, just the possibility, that maybe somehow everything would be all right. The moon rose higher, spilling silver light across the valley, and the prairie wind carried the promise of autumn into winter, of endings that might also be beginnings, of torn shoes that had walked their last mile but had also walked just far enough. Morning came slowly to the valley, the sun climbing over the eastern ridge in shades of pink and gold that painted the cottonwoods in colors Evelyn had never seen before. She woke disoriented, her body aching from the journey, her mind foggy with the residue of dreams she couldn't quite remember. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in the Chicago boarding house, listening to the sounds of the city waking up, trolley bells and factory whistles and the endless rumble of commerce. But there was no rumble here, only birdsong and the whisper of wind through grass, and somewhere in the distance, the soft lowing of cattle. Reality came flooding back. The train platform. Edward Lang's retreating back. Cole Archer's steady gray eyes. The ride through gathering darkness to this cabin, this valley, this strange new world. Evelyn sat up carefully, wincing as her bandaged feet reminded her of yesterday's ordeal. The sunlight streaming through the window was different from city light, cleaner somehow, less filtered by smoke and buildings. She looked around the cabin properly for the first time, taking in details she'd been too exhausted to notice last night. The furniture was rough but well made, clearly built by hand. The floor was swept clean. The dishes on the shelves were few but arranged with care. There were books, She counted 5 of them on a small shelf near the bed. A framed photograph on the wall showed a family, a stern-looking man and woman with 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Cole's parents, she assumed, and his siblings. Everything spoke of a life built deliberately, piece by piece, with no frills but no shortcuts either. It was the home of someone who understood that survival out here meant attention to detail, that a poorly chinked wall or a leaky roof could mean the difference between comfort and misery when winter came. A knock on the door startled her. "Miss Hart? You awake?" Cole's voice was careful, respectful of the closed door between them. Evelyn stood up, testing her weight on her damaged feet. They still hurt, but the bandages had helped. "Yes," she called back. "Just a moment." She looked down at herself and felt a fresh wave of embarrassment. She was still wearing the same travel-stained dress she'd worn yesterday. Her hair was a disaster, and she probably smelled like coal smoke and sweat. But there was nothing to be done about it now. She opened the door. Cole stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking everywhere except directly at her. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly than she had last night. He was younger than she'd first thought. Maybe 30, 32 at most. The weathering on his face came from sun and wind, not age. His hair was dark brown, slightly too long, curling at his collar. He'd shaved recently, but not this morning. A shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. "Morning," he said, still studying the porch boards as if they were the most interesting thing in Montana. "I hope you slept all right." "Better than I have in months," Evelyn said honestly. That made him look up briefly, something like relief crossing his face. "Good. That's good." He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I brought you some things." He gestured to a basket at his feet. Inside, Evelyn saw a tin coffee pot, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of what looked like preserves, some butter, and a pair of worn leather boots. "The boots were my sister's," Cole explained. "She left them here when she visited a few years back. They might be big, but they're better than—" He trailed off, looking at her bandaged feet. "Thank you." Evelyn bent to pick up the basket, but Cole stopped her. "Don't. Your feet need rest. I'll bring it in." He carried the basket to the table, set it down, then back toward the door as if afraid of lingering too long in the small space. "There's a pump out back for washing. Water's cold but clean, and there's an outhouse about 20 yards that way." He pointed. "It's not fancy, but it's functional." Evelyn felt her face warm at the practical necessity of the conversation. "Thank you for thinking of everything." "I'll be working on the fence line on the north pasture today," Cole continued, still speaking too quickly, still not quite meeting her eyes. "Should be back by early afternoon. Make yourself at home. There's more food in the root cellar if you need it. That's the door in the floor behind the stove. And if you need anything urgent, just ring the bell." He pointed to a large bell mounted on a post near the barn. "I'll hear it and come back." "Cole?" Evelyn said softly, stopping him before he could flee. "I can't just stay here and do nothing while you work. Let me help. I can cook, clean, mend things. I'm used to working." He finally looked at her properly, and she saw something complicated in his expression. A war between wanting to let her rest and understanding the pride that came from being useful. "Your feet will heal better if I'm moving on them gently rather than sitting still." She'd learned that much in the factory, where small injuries had to be worked through or you lost your position. "Please, I need to feel like I'm earning my keep." Cole considered this, then nodded slowly. "All right, but nothing that requires standing for long periods. And if your feet start bleeding again, you stop. Understood?" "Understood." "There's mending that needs doing. Shirts with buttons missing, socks that need darning, the sewing kit's in that trunk. And if you wanted to tidy up a bit—" He looked around the cabin, seeming to see it through her eyes, the bachelor disorder of it, the dust on surfaces, the general sense that housekeeping was done when absolutely necessary and not a moment before. "Well, I wouldn't complain about that either." Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest. Purpose. That's what he was offering her. Not charity, not pity, but honest work. A way to contribute. "I can do that," she said. Cole nodded, settled his hat back on his head, and turned to go. But at the door, he paused. "Evelyn? That fella yesterday." Edward Lang. He's a fool and a coward, and I hope you know that what he did says everything about him and nothing about you." Before she could respond, he was gone, his boots thudding across the porch and down the steps. Through the window, she watched him stride toward the barn with the easy, purposeful gait of a man who knew exactly what needed doing and how to do it. She was alone again, but it felt different from yesterday's aloneness. Yesterday she'd been abandoned. Today she'd been given space to breathe. Evelyn spent the next hour exploring her new temporary home. She tried on her sister's boots. They were indeed too big, but with an extra pair of socks from the trunk, they fit well enough. She washed at the pump, the icy water shocking against her skin but wonderfully clean. She ate bread with preserves and butter, and it tasted better than anything from the boarding house ever had. Then she set to work. First she swept the cabin floor, dust and dirt that had accumulated over weeks of bachelor living disappearing beneath the broom. She washed the dishes, wiped down the surfaces, shook out the rag rug by the door. She opened the window to let fresh air circulate, chasing away the closed-in smell. The mending came next. She found Cole's sewing kit in the trunk, a simple tin box with needles, thread, and buttons, and settled at the table with a pile of shirts that needed attention. Her fingers remembered the work instantly, that muscle memory from years at the factory machines. But this was different. This wasn't piecework for strangers, making the same stitch 10,000 times for pennies. This was mending clothes that someone actually wore, making things whole again. She found herself wondering about Cole as she worked. What had brought him here, to this lonely valley? He'd mentioned building the ranch after his parents died. How old had he been? What kind of strength did it take to carve a life out of this raw land? And his sister, the story he'd told last night about finding her in Denver after that mine foreman abandoned her. What exactly had happened to her in those days before Cole arrived? He'd said there were worse things than sleeping in the street, and the pain in his voice had suggested he knew exactly how much worse. Around midday, Evelyn made coffee on the wood stove and sat on the porch to drink it, watching the valley in the bright autumn sunshine. The ranch was beautiful in a stark, honest way. No pretense, no decoration, just function and survival and the raw bones of the land itself. She thought about Edward Lang and his polished boots, his silk vest, his bank office. Last night she'd been devastated by his rejection. This morning, sitting on this rough porch with a tin cup of strong coffee, she found herself feeling something different. Not gratitude exactly, but something close to it. If Edward had claimed her, she'd be in Red Willow right now, probably in some boarding house room, trying to fit herself into the shape of the woman he wanted her to be. Instead, she was here, in a place where torn shoes meant toughness instead of shame. The sound of hoofbeats brought her attention to the north. Cole was riding back, earlier than he'd said. As he got closer, she could see tension in the line of his shoulders. He dismounted at the corral, tied off his horse, and walked toward the cabin. His face was carefully neutral, but his jaw was tight. "Everything all right?" Evelyn asked, standing up. "Fine," Cole said shortly. Then, seeing her expression, he sighed. "No, not fine. We're going to have company." "Company?" "Riders from town, 3 of them. I saw them on the ridgeline. They're about 20 minutes behind me." He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair in a gesture that spoke of frustration. "They're coming to check on you. Make sure you're here of your own free will, probably. Make sure I'm not holding you against your wishes." Evelyn felt her stomach drop. "They think you kidnapped me." "Some folks think that, I imagine. Others probably just want to gawk. Small town, not much entertainment." His voice was bitter. "I should have expected this. Should have known they'd come sniffing around." "What do we do?" Cole looked at her, and she saw something fierce in his eyes. "We tell them the truth. You're here because you chose to be. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. Everything's proper and above board. And if they don't like it, they can ride back to town and choke on their gossip." Despite her nervousness, Evelyn almost smiled. "You have a way with words. My mother always said my diplomacy needed work." He glanced toward the ridge. "You should probably know, one of the riders is likely to be Edward Lang." The name hit her like cold water. "Edward?" "He's on the town council. Considers himself an upstanding citizen. He'll want to make sure his reputation isn't damaged by yesterday's scene." Cole's voice was flat, but anger simmered beneath it. He'll probably try to paint himself as the concerned party, worried about your welfare. That's rich, considering he's the one who abandoned me. Rich indeed. But that's how men like him operate. They rewrite history so they're always the hero. Cole settled his hat back on his head. Just remember, you don't owe him explanations. You don't owe him anything. They waited, the tension stretching between them like a wire. Evelyn went inside and checked her reflection in the small mirror near the wash basin. She looked better than yesterday, clean at least, her hair brushed and pinned properly. But the dress was still stained and worn. There was nothing to be done about that. Cole stayed on the porch, standing with his arms crossed, watching the North Ridge. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 minutes, the riders appeared. There were 3 of them, just as Cole had said. Edward Lang was in the lead, still dressed impeccably. His horse, a fine chestnut mare that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Behind him rode 2 other men, one older, with a silver beard and a sheriff's star on his vest, the other younger, thin and nervous looking. They rode down into the valley and stopped about 10 feet from the porch. Edward's eyes went immediately to Evelyn, standing in the cabin doorway, and something flickered across his face. Relief? Annoyance? She couldn't tell. "Miss Hart," Edward said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm relieved to see you're unharmed." Cole spoke before Evelyn could respond. "Why wouldn't she be unharmed, Lang?" "Well, Archer, you must understand how it looked. A young woman, fresh off the train, clearly distressed, and then you ride off with her. Some folks in town were concerned." "Some folks?" The sheriff spoke up, his voice gravelly. "Or just you, Edward?" Edward's smile tightened. "I merely thought it prudent to ensure Miss Hart's well-being." "Her well-being," Cole repeated flatly. "That's real noble of you, considering you're the one who left her standing on that platform like yesterday's garbage. Now, see here. No, you see here." Cole's voice was quiet but hard as iron. "You brought that woman all the way from Chicago with pretty promises, then took one look at her and decided she wasn't good enough for you. You humiliated her in front of the whole town. And now you ride out here pretending to be concerned? That's not concern, Lang. That's guilt." Edward's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "Gentlemen," the sheriff held up a hand. "That's enough." He turned to Evelyn, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Miss Hart, I'm Sheriff Tom Wilson. I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to ask, are you here of your own free will?" Evelyn stepped out onto the porch, forcing herself to stand straight despite the pain in her feet. "I am, Sheriff Wilson." "Mr. Archer hasn't coerced you or forced you in any way?" "No, sir. Mr. Archer saw that I had nowhere to go and offered me shelter. He's been nothing but respectful." The sheriff nodded slowly. "And you're aware that you could come back to town if you wished? There's a boarding house, respectable and safe." "The same boarding house that would charge her $2 a week she doesn't have," Cole interjected. "Real helpful, Tom." "I'm just laying out our options, Cole." "I appreciate that, Sheriff," Evelyn said, "but I choose to stay here. Mr. Archer has given me honest work in exchange for room and board. Everything is proper. He sleeps in the barn." "The barn?" Edward's voice was sharp with disbelief. "That's highly irregular." "What's irregular," Evelyn said, her voice rising, "is a man who promises marriage and then abandons his would-be bride because her shoes weren't pretty enough." Silence fell like a hammer. The young man behind the sheriff made a choking sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Even Sheriff Wilson looked uncomfortable. Edward's face had gone from red to white. "Miss Hart, you must understand, I had certain expectations." "I understand perfectly, Mr. Lang." Evelyn felt anger rising in her chest, hot and cleansing. "You wanted a wife who looked good on your arm. Someone who would make you seem charitable and generous without actually costing you anything. You wanted the appearance of goodness without any of the reality. Well, I'm sorry I didn't meet your standards. I'm sorry my poverty embarrassed you. But I'm not sorry I'm here instead of in town, because at least here I'm with someone who sees me as a human being instead of a fashion accessory." "Well said, miss," the sheriff murmured. Edward opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. This is completely inappropriate. You're living alone with a man. I'm living in a cabin while a man sleeps in his barn," Evelyn corrected. If you find that scandalous, Mr. Lang, then I suggest you examine why you're so interested in my living arrangements after making it very clear yesterday that you wanted nothing to do with me. Cole made a sound that was definitely a laugh. Edward shot him a venomous look. Look, the sheriff said, clearly wanting to end this before it escalated further. Miss Hart seems clear-headed and aware of her situation. Colt, you're keeping everything above board? I sleep in the barn, Tom. You can check if you want. I don't need to check. I know you're an honest man. The sheriff turned his horse. Edward, you've seen she's safe. Let's head back. But Edward wasn't finished. He looked at Evelyn and something in his expression had changed. Calculation replacing embarrassment. Miss Hart, I may have been hasty yesterday. Perhaps we could discuss matters more reasonably. If you were to return to town, I'm sure we could come to some arrangement. No. The word came out flat and final. Evelyn was surprised by her own certainty. No? Edward blinked. But surely you'd prefer a life in town with amenities and society rather than this? He gestured at the ranch with barely concealed disdain. This is an honest life, Mr. Lang, something you apparently know very little about. Evelyn felt Cole's presence behind her, solid and reassuring. I'm staying here. Edward's mask of civility finally cracked. You're making a mistake. Living out here with a cowboy, doing menial work. You could have been the wife of a banker. You could have had a real future. I have a future, Evelyn said quietly. It just doesn't include you. For a long moment, Edward stared at her. Then he yanked his horse's head around and spurred it back toward the ridge, leaving the others scrambling to follow. The sheriff tipped his hat. Miss Hart, if you need anything, the office is always open. Thank you, Sheriff. They watched the three riders disappear over the ridge. Only when they were completely out of sight did Evelyn feel her knees start to shake. She grabbed the porch railing for support. You all right? Cole's hand was on her elbow, steadying her. I just told off a banker in front of a sheriff, Evelyn said, somewhere between laughing and crying. My mother would be horrified. Your mother would be proud. Cole guided her to sit on the porch steps. That took courage. It took anger. Evelyn pressed her hands to her face. I've never spoken to anyone like that before. Ever. I was always so careful, so polite, so desperate to please everyone, because I needed the work, needed the money, needed people to like me enough to keep me around. And how does it feel now? She thought about it. Terrifying. Liberating. Both at once. Cole sat down beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them. Edward Lang is going to tell everyone in town that you're living in sin out here. You know that, right? Let him. It'll make things difficult if you ever want to go back. I don't want to go back. The words came out with surprising force. That town watched me get humiliated and did nothing. They whispered and stared and made me feel like dirt. Why would I ever want to go back there? Fair point. Cole was quiet for a moment. But, Evelyn, you should know. Staying here, it's going to be hard. Winter's coming, and winters in Montana aren't like anything in Chicago. We'll be snowed in for weeks at a time. It's isolating, it's cold, the work is endless. And people in town, they'll talk. They'll assume things. That won't just hurt you, it'll hurt me too. Are you saying you want me to leave? No. He said it quickly, definitely. No, I'm saying you should understand what you're choosing. I don't want you to stay out of pride and then hate it here. I don't want you to feel trapped. Evelyn looked out at the valley, the cottonwoods swaying in the wind, the cattle grazing peacefully, the mountains rising purple and magnificent in the distance. I've felt trapped my whole adult life, Cole. Trapped in factories, trapped in boarding houses, trapped in poverty. This doesn't feel like a trap. This feels like the first real choice I've ever made. Then you can stay. His voice was gruff. Long as you need. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the grass. After a while, Cole stood and stretched. I should get back to that fence line. Lost half the day to those fools from town. Wait. Evelyn stood too, testing her feet. The standing during the confrontation had made them ache, but it was bearable. Teach me something. Teach you what? Anything. How to work a ranch. How to survive out here. I want to learn. She saw his hesitation and pressed on. You said the work is endless. Let me help, really help, not just with mending and cooking. Teach me how to do this life. Cole studied her for a long moment. You're serious? Completely. A slow smile spread across his face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his whole face, erasing the hard lines and making him look younger, almost boyish. All right then, come on. He led her to the corral where his horse, a sturdy bay gelding, was munching hay. This is Rusty. Had him for 6 years, best cow horse in the territory. If you're going to live on a ranch, you need to be able to ride. I know, we'll start slow. For the next hour, as the sun tracked west and the shadows grew long, Cole taught her the basics. How to approach a horse without spooking it. How to read its body language. How to put on a bridle, how to saddle properly, how to check the cinch. His hands were patient, his voice calm and instructive. When she struggled with the saddle, it was heavier than she'd expected. He helped without making her feel weak. When she got nervous around Rusty's hindquarters, he explained about standing close so the kick wouldn't have power, or standing far enough away to be safe. Everything on a ranch is about respect, he said. Respect for the animals, for the land, for the weather. You listen more than you talk. You watch more than you act. And you never assume you know everything, because that's when the land teaches you a hard lesson. Evelyn absorbed it all, filing away information like she used to file away the supervisor's instructions at the factory. But this was different. This wasn't about survival through submission. This was about survival through competence. By the time Cole declared the lesson over, her feet were throbbing, and she was exhausted, but she'd managed to saddle Rusty all by herself. It wasn't pretty, and Cole had to adjust half of what she'd done, but she'd done it. Good work, he said, and the simple praise made her chest warm. They walked back to the cabin together, the evening light turning everything golden. Cole stopped at the pump to wash, and Evelyn found herself watching the efficient way he moved. No wasted motion, every action purposeful. He was built for this life, shaped by it the same way stone was shaped by water. You hungry? He asked, drying his face on his bandana. Starving. I'll cook tonight. You've been on your feet enough. He was true to his word. While Evelyn sat at the table resting her aching feet, Cole moved around the small cabin kitchen with surprising competence. He fried up salt pork, made pan biscuits, opened a jar of beans from the root cellar. Nothing fancy, but the smells made Evelyn's mouth water. They ate at the small table as dusk settled over the valley. For a while they didn't talk, both too hungry for conversation. But eventually, as Cole poured them both coffee, Evelyn asked the question that had been nagging at her all day. Why here? Why this valley? Cole wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, staring into the dark liquid. After my parents died, I had a choice. Stay in Texas and work someone else's ranch, or head north and start my own. I'd heard Montana still had open land, places where a man could homestead if he was willing to work hard enough. So you just came? Just came. Rode north with everything I owned tied to my saddle. Must have looked at 20 different valleys before I found this one. He glanced out the window at the darkness. Soon as I saw it, I knew. The creek for water, the grass for grazing, those cottonwoods for lumber and windbreak. It was like the land was waiting. Do you ever regret it, the isolation? Cole was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he did, his voice was thoughtful. Sometimes. Gets lonely in winter, especially. Goes weeks without seeing another soul. But then I remember what it was like working for other people, taking orders, building someone else's dream. This is mine. Every fence post, every board in this cabin, every head of cattle, mine. That's worth the loneliness. I understand that, Evelyn said softly. More than you might think. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, a sense of two people who'd each been alone in their own way, now sharing space. Cole looked away first, clearing his throat. I should let you get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch. He cleaned the dishes, despite her protests, then headed for the door. But he paused on the threshold, looking back at her. Evelyn, what you did today, standing up to Lang like that took real courage. I was terrified. Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing the thing anyway. He smiled slightly. You're going to do just fine out here." After he left, Evelyn sat at the table for a long time, sipping her coffee and listening to the night sounds through the open window. Somewhere an owl called. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods. Cattle settled down for the night. She thought about Edward Lang and his polished world. She thought about the factory in Chicago with its machines and smoke. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd tried to be: obedient daughter, desperate worker, hopeful mail-order bride. And then she thought about who she might become here, in this valley, with this strange cowboy who saw strength where others saw failure. Outside, Cole spread his bedroll in the barn loft, the hay sweet-smelling beneath him. He lay on his back, staring at the darkness, and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. He'd meant what he said. He wasn't looking for complications, wasn't looking for anything except the steady rhythm of ranching life. But Evelyn Hart was already a complication. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she fit here in a way that surprised him. The way she'd handled Edward Lang today, fierce and honest and refusing to back down. The way she'd insisted on learning to work, not just existing as a guest. The way she'd looked standing at his table in her borrowed boots, mending his shirts like it was the most natural thing in the world. He told himself he was helping her the way he wished someone had helped his sister. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. There was something about Evelyn that called to something in him, something he'd thought was long dead. Cole rolled over, punching the hay into a more comfortable shape, and told himself to stop thinking like a fool. She'd be here a few months at most, then move on to whatever came next. That was fine. That was good. He didn't need the complication of feelings. But as he drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of her smile when she'd successfully saddled Rusty, proud and surprised and so alive it had made his chest ache. In the cabin, Evelyn changed into the one clean dress from her suitcase and climbed into bed. The mattress was lumpy but comfortable, the quilts heavy and warm. Through the window she could see stars, so many stars, scattered across the sky like someone had thrown diamonds against black velvet. She'd walked 1,000 miles to be rejected by a man who couldn't see past her torn shoes. But that rejection had brought her here, to this valley, to a life she never could have imagined for herself. Maybe, she thought as sleep pulled her under, maybe sometimes the wrong doors closing were really the right ones opening. And outside, the Montana night settled over the valley like a blanket, the wind carrying the promise of frost and the first hint of winter, of endings becoming beginnings, of two lonely people who'd found themselves sharing the same small patch of earth under an endless sky. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that surprised Evelyn with its steadiness. She woke each morning to the sound of Cole already moving around outside, feeding the horses, checking the cattle, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running. By the time she had coffee brewing, he would appear at the door, hat in hand, asking what needed doing that day, as if she had any authority to tell him. It became their morning ritual. Coffee on the porch, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge, discussing the day's work in quiet voices that didn't disturb the peace of dawn. Cole would outline what he planned to do: mending fence, checking water sources, moving cattle to fresh grazing, and Evelyn would list her own tasks, smaller but no less necessary: washing, cooking, tending the vegetable garden that was already starting to die back with the approaching cold. Her feet healed slowly. The blisters scabbed over, the swelling went down, and after a week she could walk without wincing. Cole had been right about the boots. They were too big, but with enough socks they worked. She felt clumsy in them at first, used to the delicate shoes city women wore, but gradually she understood their purpose. Out here you needed boots that could handle mud and rock and the occasional snake. Fashion was a luxury the prairie couldn't afford. On the third day, Cole taught her to milk the cow he kept in a small pen behind the barn. The animal was placid and patient, while Evelyn fumbled with the technique, her city hands uncertain of the rhythm. Cole sat beside her on a hay bale, talking her through it in that calm voice he used with skittish animals. Steady pressure, not too hard. She'll let you know if you're doing it wrong. He demonstrated on the other side, his large hands surprisingly gentle. There's a trust that happens between you and a milk cow. You take care of her, she takes care of you. It's a partnership. Evelyn watched the milk stream into the bucket and felt an absurd sense of accomplishment. I did it. You did. There was approval in his voice, the kind that wasn't given freely, which made it mean something when it came. On the fifth day, she rode Rusty for the first time. Cole led the horse in a wide circle around the corral, while Evelyn clung to the saddle horn, certain she was going to fall and break her neck. But gradually, as her body learned to move with the horse's gait, the fear receded. By the end of the hour, she was almost comfortable. "You're a natural," Cole said, and she could tell he meant it rather than just being kind. "I'm terrified." Same thing sometimes. He helped her dismount, his hands on her waist steadying and then quickly gone. Fear means you're smart enough to know the risks. Courage means you do it anyway. They worked side by side as the days grew shorter and the nights colder. Cole showed her how to split kindling, how to bank a fire so it would last through the night, how to read the sky for coming weather. She showed him how to make bread that didn't taste like rocks, how to darn socks so they'd last another season, how to get stains out of shirts that he'd thought were permanently ruined. It was trade, she realized, not charity. They were each bringing something valuable to this arrangement, each filling gaps in the other's knowledge. It made her feel less like a burden and more like a partner, even if neither of them used that word. The nights were the hardest. After supper, Cole would disappear to the barn, and Evelyn would be alone in the cabin with nothing but her thoughts. She'd read from his small collection of books, mostly practical volumes about ranching and animal husbandry, but also a worn copy of Hawthorne, and surprisingly a volume of Whitman's poetry. She wondered which of them Cole read more often. Sometimes she'd stand at the window and watch the lamplight in the barn, wondering what he was doing out there, if he was reading too or just lying in the darkness thinking. She wondered if he was lonely the way she was lonely, if the careful distance they maintained during the day felt as fragile to him as it did to her. Because something was building between them, slow and inevitable as the turning of seasons. It was in the way his hand would linger a moment too long when he helped her over rough ground. In the way she found herself watching him work, admiring the competent strength of his movements. In the quiet conversations that stretched longer each evening before he retreated to the barn. Neither of them acknowledged it. The rules were clear. She was a guest, he was a host, everything was proper and temporary. But the rules and the reality were starting to diverge, and Evelyn didn't know what to do about it. 2 weeks after her arrival, Cole came back from town with supplies and news. He'd ridden in early that morning, returning just as the sun was starting to set. Evelyn had been worried. He usually told her when he was going somewhere, but when she saw his face, her concern shifted to alarm. What happened? Cole dismounted heavily, moving like a man who'd aged 10 years in a day. Nothing good. He tied Rusty to the rail and started unloading supplies. Edward Lang's been talking, telling anyone who'll listen that you're living in sin out here, that I took advantage of a desperate woman, that someone should do something about it. Evelyn's stomach dropped. Do something? What does that mean? Means he's stirring up trouble. Got some of the church ladies all worked up about morality and propriety. Cole's jaw was tight. Mrs. Henderson suggested you should be removed from this situation for your own protection. Said they could find you proper employment in town, proper lodging. Proper meaning under their supervision. Exactly. He carried a sack of flour into the cabin, his movements sharp with anger. I told them you were here of your own free will, that everything was respectable, but Lang's got influence. He's making himself look like the concerned citizen while painting me as some kind of predator. Evelyn followed him inside. That's ridiculous. You've been nothing but honorable. Doesn't matter what's true. Matters what people believe. Cole set the flour on the table harder than necessary. And right now, Lang's version is winning. They stared at each other across the small cabin. The lamplight threw shadows that made Cole's face harder, older. Evelyn saw the frustration there, but also something else. Fear, maybe, or resignation. The look of a man who'd fought this battle before and lost. What do we do? She asked quietly. I don't know. He pulled off his hat and ran his hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration she was coming to recognize. Short of you leaving or us getting married, I don't see how we solve this. The word hung in the air between them. Married. It should have been absurd. They'd known each other 2 weeks, but something about the way he'd said it, casual and impossible at once, made her heart race. That's not a real option, Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice steady. No, course not. Cole turned away, busying himself with unpacking supplies. But it's what they'll expect. Either you leave and prove Lang right that you needed rescuing, or we marry and make it respectable. Those are the only endings that fit their story. And what about our story? Don't we get to decide how it ends? He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I don't know what our story is, Evelyn. I thought I did when I pulled you off that platform. Thought I was just helping someone who needed help, giving them time to figure things out. But now? Now I don't know if you're still figuring things out or if you've already figured them, and I'm too damn scared to ask what conclusion you reached. The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Evelyn felt her heart pounding. This was the moment, she realized. The moment when they stopped pretending this was temporary, stopped pretending the careful distance they maintained was enough. I'm not leaving, she said. I don't care what Edward Lang says or what the town thinks. I'm not leaving unless you tell me to go. I won't do that. Then we find another way. We keep living our lives, and eventually they'll get bored and find something else to gossip about. Cole shook his head. You don't understand how small towns work. This won't blow over. It'll just get worse. Lang will keep pushing until something breaks. Then let it break. Evelyn surprised herself with the fierceness in her voice. I've spent my whole life bending to what other people thought was proper. Being the good girl, the obedient worker, the grateful charity case. I'm done with that. If they want to think badly of me, let them. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's enough. Is it? The question was quiet, almost lost in the gathering darkness. Because I'm finding it harder every day to pretend I'm just being neighborly. Finding it harder to sleep in that barn knowing you're in here alone. Finding it harder to keep my distance when all I want is... He stopped, his jaw working like he was physically biting back the words. What do you want, Cole? For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. More than I have a right to. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged like before a thunderstorm. Evelyn took a step toward him, then another. Cole stood frozen, watching her approach like she was a wild thing that might spook. What if you do have a right? She asked. What if we both do? Evelyn. Her name was a warning and a plea. Don't. Don't say things you don't mean just because you're angry at Lang and the town. Don't make this complicated because you think you owe me something. This isn't about owing you. She was close enough now to see the pulse jumping in his throat, to smell the dust and leather and something uniquely him. This is about the fact that I wake up every morning hoping you'll linger a few minutes longer over coffee. This is about how I watch you work and think about how those hands would feel. She stopped, her courage suddenly failing her. How they'd feel doing what? The question was rough, almost angry, but his eyes were dark with something that definitely wasn't anger. Touching me, she whispered, not just helping me over rocks or steadying me on a horse, really touching me. Cole closed his eyes like he was in pain. You're going to kill me. I'm being honest. For the first time in my life, I'm being completely honest about what I want. And I want you to stop sleeping in the barn. I want you to stop treating me like I'm made of glass. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was fierce and desperate, his hands coming up to frame her face, his mouth claiming hers like he'd been starving and she was sustenance. Evelyn made a sound of surprise that became something else as she kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. They broke apart, gasping, staring at each other with something like shock. I shouldn't have done that, Cole said, but he didn't move away. Yes, you should have. Evelyn was trembling, her heart racing. You should have done it days ago. This is a mistake. Probably. People will say, let them say whatever they want. She pulled him back down, kissing him again, softer this time but no less intense. When they broke apart, she whispered against his mouth, I don't care about proper anymore. I care about real. And this feels more real than anything else in my life. Cole rested his forehead against hers, his breath coming hard. If we do this, there's no going back. You understand that? Once we cross this line, everything changes. Good. I want it to change. Evelyn. He pulled back to look at her, his hands still cupping her face. I'm not a rich man. I can't give you the life Edward Lang could have given you. This ranch is small. The work is hard. Winters are brutal. You'd be choosing a difficult life. I'm choosing an honest life with an honest man. She smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. That's worth more than all of Edward Lang's money. Something in Cole's expression cracked open. He pulled her against his chest, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She felt him shaking, felt his heart pounding against hers. I don't know how to do this, he said into her hair. Haven't let myself feel like this since... God, I don't know if I've ever felt like this. Then we'll figure it out together. She pulled back to look at him. That's what we've been doing all along, isn't it? Figuring things out together? He laughed, the sound rough and surprised. When did you get so wise? Somewhere between the train platform and here. You might have had something to do with it. They stood holding each other as the lamplight flickered and the night deepened outside. Finally, reluctantly, Cole stepped back. I should still sleep in the barn, he said. Not because I want to, but because I'm trying to do right by you. If we're going to have any chance of making the town accept this, we need to be careful. Careful, Evelyn repeated, disappointed but understanding. For now. But Evelyn? He touched her face gently, his calloused thumb tracing her cheekbone. I meant what I said. I want more than I have a right to. And if you're willing, if you're sure, then we'll find a way to make this right. Properly right. She understood what he was asking without asking. Marriage. A real marriage. Not the false promise Edward Lang had offered, but something built on respect and partnership, and this fierce, surprising feeling that had grown between them. I'm sure, she said. Cole kissed her again, gentler this time, almost reverent. Then he grabbed his hat and headed for the door, pausing on the threshold. Sleep well, Evelyn Hart. You too, Cole Archer. After he left, Evelyn sat at the table, her fingers touching her lips where she could still feel the pressure of his kiss. Everything had changed in the space of a conversation, a few honest words, a moment of courage from both of them. Tomorrow, there would be plans to make, problems to solve. Edward Lang wouldn't stop his campaign just because they'd decided they cared for each other. The town wouldn't suddenly approve. Winter was still coming, with all its challenges. But tonight, she'd been honest about what she wanted. And incredibly, miraculously, what she wanted had wanted her back. The next morning brought frost on the grass and a crispness to the air that spoke of deeper cold to come. Evelyn woke early, her heart already racing with anticipation and nervousness about facing Cole after last night. Would it be awkward? Would he regret what he'd said? But when he appeared at the door for coffee, his smile was genuine and warm, reaching his eyes in a way it hadn't before. The careful distance was gone, replaced by something easier, more natural. Morning, he said, and the simple word felt weighted with everything they weren't saying. Morning. They worked side by side that day, and if their hands touched more often than necessary, if they found excuses to stand closer than strictly required, neither of them mentioned it. But the air between them hummed with possibility, with promise, with the beginning of something neither wanted to name too soon for fear of breaking it. That afternoon, Cole took her to a place she hadn't seen before. A meadow about a mile from the cabin, sheltered on three sides by low hills. In the center grew a patch of wildflowers, their blooms fading now with the season but still hanging on stubbornly against the cold. My mother loved flowers, Cole said, dismounting and helping Evelyn down. When we first came west, she'd collect seeds from every place we stopped. Said flowers were how you knew a place was home, when they came back year after year without you having to replant them. Evelyn walked among the dying blooms, touching their petals gently. There were asters and late-blooming columbine, some black-eyed Susans that had already gone to seed. You planted these for her? After she died, yeah. Brought seeds from her garden in Texas, planted them here. He looked around the meadow, his expression soft with memory. Took a few years for them to take hold, but they come back now every spring. She would have liked that. Liked knowing something of hers kept living even after she was gone. It's beautiful, Cole. Thank you for showing me. He looked at her then, the late afternoon sun turning his eyes lighter, almost silver. I wanted you to see it, wanted you to know about this place, about her, about... He trailed off, searching for words. About the things that matter to me. Evelyn understood. This was his way of letting her in, of showing her the tender places beneath the rough exterior. Tell me about her. Your mother. They sat in the grass and Cole talked. About his mother who'd been tough as nails but cried over poetry. About his father who'd taught him to read the land, to respect what it could give and fear what it could take away. About growing up in Texas, learning to ride before he could properly walk, sleeping under stars more nights than under a roof. They wanted better for us, he said. That's why they came west. Thought there was more opportunity out here, more chance to build something lasting. They died before they could see it happen, but I think they'd be proud of what I've done with this place. I think they would be too. What about yours? Your parents? So Evelyn told him. About her father coming home from the war changed, haunted by things he wouldn't talk about. About her mother taking in sewing to make ends meet, her fingers bleeding by firelight. About the slow decline after her father died, how her mother had just seemed to give up without him. They loved each other so much, she said. Even when they had nothing, they had that. I used to think it was romantic. Now I think maybe it was just survival, holding on to each other because everything else was falling apart. That's what love is sometimes, Cole said quietly, holding on when everything else wants you to let go. Their eyes met, and Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. This man understood loss the way she did, understood what it meant to keep going when it would be easier to quit. They were kindred in their stubbornness, their refusal to be beaten by circumstances that should have broken them. Cole, she started, but he shook his head. Don't. Not yet. I want to do this right. He stood up, brushing off his pants. There's things that need to be said, things that need to be decided, but I want to be sure we're both thinking clearly and not just caught up in the moment. How long do we need to think? Few days, maybe a week. He helped her to her feet. I want you to be certain, Evelyn. Want you to have time to really consider what you'd be choosing. She wanted to argue, to tell him she was already certain, but she saw the wisdom in waiting. This was too important to rush, too permanent to risk getting wrong. They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, the horses picking their way carefully through the dimming light. When they reached the cabin, Cole helped her dismount, his hands on her waist, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for today, Evelyn said, for showing me your mother's garden, for trusting me with that. Thank you for listening. He stepped back, creating distance again. Sleep well. You too. But neither of them slept well that night. Cole lay in the barn loft, staring at the darkness, thinking about a future he'd stopped letting himself imagine years ago. A partner to share the work and the silence. Children, maybe, running through the meadow where his mother's flowers grew. Growing old with someone who understood what this life demanded and chose it anyway. It terrified him how much he wanted it, how much he wanted her. In the cabin, Evelyn lay awake thinking similar thoughts. She'd come west expecting one kind of life and found something completely different. But different didn't mean worse. Different meant authentic, real, built on mutual respect rather than economic transaction. She thought about Edward Lang and his polished world, his careful respectability. That life would have slowly suffocated her, she realized. She would have become smaller and smaller, fitting herself into the shape he required until there was nothing left of who she really was. Here, with Cole, she was becoming more herself, stronger, braver, more certain of her own worth. That was worth more than any amount of comfort or social standing. 3 days passed in careful consideration. They worked together, talked together, learned more about each other's hopes and fears and dreams. Cole told her about wanting to expand the herd, maybe add some horses to break and sell. Evelyn admitted she'd always wanted to learn to read and write better, maybe even teach someday. There's a school in Red Willow, Cole said, but they might start one closer out here if enough families settle. You could teach that. Families would need to want their children taught by a woman living in sin. Families would need to want their children taught by my wife. The word hung between them, deliberate this time, intentional. Evelyn's breath caught. Is that a proposal, Cole Archer? Not yet, but it will be. Soon. He smiled at her, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. I just want to make sure you're ready to hear it when I ask. I'm ready now. Few more days. I want to be sure. On the fourth evening, they stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, too vivid to be real. The temperature had dropped sharply, and Evelyn shivered despite her shawl. Cole noticed immediately, shrugging out of his jacket and draping it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body, smelling of leather and wood smoke and him. "Winter's coming fast," he said. "Another week or two, we'll see the first real snow. I've never seen snow like Montana snow. It's different here. Comes down for days sometimes, piles up taller than a man. We'll be snowed in more than once. Sounds peaceful." "Sounds isolated." Evelyn looked at him. "Is that what you're worried about? That I'll get cabin fever, regret choosing this life when I can't escape it?" "Among other things." "Cole." She turned to face him fully. "I've had 4 days to think, just like you wanted. And I keep coming back to the same conclusion. This is where I want to be. With you. Building whatever comes next. I'm not going to change my mind when the snow comes, or the work gets harder, or the loneliness sets in. This is my choice. You're my choice." He looked at her for a long moment, something working in his jaw. Then he took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "Then I guess I've waited long enough." He cleared his throat. "Evelyn Hart, I'm not good with fancy words, can't make pretty speeches or write the kind of letters that sound like poetry, but I can promise you honesty. Can promise I'll work hard to give you the best life I'm capable of providing. Can promise I'll respect you and listen to you and never make you feel small." He paused, and she saw vulnerability in his eyes. "And I can promise that somewhere along the way, between that train platform and now, I fell in love with you. So if you'll have me, if you're really sure, then I'm asking you to be my wife." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. "That's the most beautiful proposal I've ever heard. It's the only proposal you've ever heard. It's still the most beautiful." She squeezed his hand. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Cole pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was something precious he'd been afraid to break. She felt his heart pounding against hers, felt his breath in her hair. "We'll do it right," he said. "Get the circuit preacher when he comes through next month. Have witnesses, make it legal and proper so nobody can say otherwise." "I don't care about proper. I know, but I do. I want you to have the wedding you deserve, even if it's just us and a preacher in this cabin." Evelyn pulled back to look at him. "Can I tell you a secret? Always. I don't want a big wedding. I don't want a fancy dress or a church full of people who'll judge me. I just want you, and a promise, and a life we build together. That's all I've ever really wanted." Cole kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that promised forever in the best way possible. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling. "Well then," he said, "looks like we're getting married." "Looks like we are." They stood holding each other as the stars came out, as the temperature dropped and the first frost of the evening settled on the grass. Tomorrow they'd have to plan, have to figure out logistics, and face whatever reaction came from town. Tomorrow there'd be challenges and obstacles, and probably more gossip from Edward Lang. But tonight, they'd found each other. Two people who'd been alone in different ways, who'd walked their separate paths through pain and loss until those paths converged here, in this valley, under this vast Montana sky. Inside, the cabin waited with its warmth and light. Outside, the barn stood empty, because Cole Archer wouldn't be sleeping there anymore. The time for careful distance was over. The time for building something real, something lasting, had begun. And in the meadow a mile away, wildflowers dreamed of spring while frost touched their petals, knowing that some things were worth enduring winter for. Some things were worth holding on to, even when the cold came and the world went dark. Some things, like love, like hope, like home, bloomed in their own time, refusing to be hurried or denied, growing strong in the places where they chose to take root. The news reached Red Willow before Cole and Evelyn had a chance to tell anyone themselves. Small towns had a way of knowing things, of sensing change in the air like animals sensing a coming storm. By the time Cole rode into town 3 days after the proposal to arrange for the circuit preacher, Half the population already seemed to know that the disgraced mail-order bride and the reclusive rancher were planning to marry. The reactions were mixed, predictable in their variety. Some folks nodded approvingly, seeing it as the proper solution to an improper situation. Others whispered that it was a shame, a rushed thing born of scandal rather than genuine feeling. And Edward Lang, when he heard, went white with fury in a way that made the bank tellers nervous. Cole was at the general store, arranging for supplies to be held until after the first snow, when Edward confronted him. The banker strode through the door like a man on a mission, his expensive coat swirling behind him, his face tight with barely controlled rage. "Archer," he said, the word sharp as a slap. "A word. Outside." Cole took his time finishing his order with Mr. Henderson, the store owner, deliberately casual. "I'm in the middle of something, Lang. It can wait." "It cannot wait." The store had gone quiet, everyone pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. Cole sighed, paid for his purchases, and followed Edward out onto the boardwalk. The autumn sun was bright and cold, casting sharp shadows. "What do you want?" Cole asked, leaning against the storefront with his arms crossed. "You're making a mistake," Edward said without preamble. "Marrying that woman. She's beneath you." Cole's jaw tightened. "Careful, Lang." "I'm serious." "Do you know anything about her? About where she really came from? She could be anyone, could have any sort of past. You're taking an enormous risk." "The only risk here is you getting your teeth knocked out if you keep talking." Edward's face flushed. "I'm trying to help you. I know you think you're being noble, rescuing her from the situation from the unfortunate circumstances at the station. But marriage? That's not rescue. That's foolishness." "What this is," Cole said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet, "is none of your damn business. You gave up any right to have an opinion about Evelyn Hart the moment you turned your back on her. She's going to be my wife, and if you or anyone else in this town has a problem with that, you can take it up with me directly." "People are talking, Archer, saying she manipulated you, trapped you into this." "Let them talk." Cole pushed off from the wall, standing at his full height. He had several inches on Edward, and he used them now, stepping closer until the banker had to tilt his head back slightly. "Here's what I think is really happening. I think you're embarrassed. I think you know you made yourself look like a coward and a fool, and seeing Evelyn happy with someone else eats at you, so you're trying to poison the well, make everyone else as miserable as you are. That's not—" "I'm not finished." Cole's voice was steel. "You don't get to reject her and then dictate what she does next. You don't get to pretend you care about her well-being after you left her standing on that platform like garbage. And you sure as hell don't get to tell me who I can and can't marry. Are we clear?" Edward opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For a moment he looked like he might actually take a swing, and part of Cole almost hoped he would. But then Sheriff Wilson appeared around the corner, taking in the scene with knowing eyes. "Everything all right here, gentlemen?" "Fine, Tom," Cole said, not taking his eyes off Edward. "Mr. Lang was just leaving." Edward straightened his coat with sharp, angry movements. "This isn't over, Archer." "Yeah, it is." They watched him stride away, his boots clicking hard against the boardwalk. Sheriff Wilson waited until he was out of earshot before speaking. "He's been stirring up trouble, Cole. You know that, right?" "I know. Got some of the town council thinking maybe they should step in for the ladies' protection." Wilson shook his head. "It's nonsense, course. I told them Evelyn made her choice clear, but Lang's persuasive when he wants to be." "What are they planning?" "Nothing official yet, but there's talk of sending some folks out to your place, maybe Mrs. Henderson and Reverend Matthews when he comes through, just to make sure Evelyn knows she has options." Cole felt his temper rising. "She knows her options. She chose me." "I know that, you know that. But Lang's got them convinced she's under some kind of undue influence." Wilson clapped him on the shoulder. "Just be prepared for company, is all I'm saying, and try not to punch anyone, even if they deserve it." Cole rode back to the ranch with supplies and a simmering anger that took the entire 8 miles to cool. By the time he reached the valley, the sun was starting to dip toward the western ridge, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made the approaching confrontation feel absurd. How could anyone think something wrong was happening in a place this beautiful? Evelyn was in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the hard freeze came. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and her borrowed dress was muddy at the hem from kneeling in the dirt. She looked up as he approached, her smile fading when she saw his face. What happened? He told her everything as they walked to the cabin together, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "So they're coming here," she said when he finished, "to rescue me from you." "Looks like? That's ridiculous." "That's Edward Lang." Cole held the door open for her, following her inside. "But Evelyn, you should know, if you want to wait on the wedding, make sure everyone knows this is your choice. I'll understand. We can take our time. Let things settle." She turned to face him, her eyes fierce. "Absolutely not. We're getting married as soon as the preacher arrives, exactly as planned. I won't let Edward Lang dictate one more second of my life." "Even if it means the whole town talks?" "Especially if it means the whole town talks." She crossed her arms. "Cole, I told you I was done bending to what other people thought was proper. I meant it. If they want to come out here and question my choices, let them come. I'll tell them the same thing I told the sheriff. I'm here because I want to be, and I'm marrying you because I love you." It was the first time she'd said it directly, without qualification or hedging. Cole felt something warm unfurl in his chest. "You love me," he repeated, wanting to hear it again. Evelyn's expression softened. "I love you. Is that so surprising?" "Little bit, yeah." He crossed the small space between them, pulling her into his arms. "I'm just a rancher with dirt under his nails and a cabin that barely keeps out the cold. I could have had nothing," she interrupted. "Nothing real, anyway. Edward Lang offered me a fantasy built on conditions I could never meet. You offered me partnership, respect, a chance to be myself instead of whoever someone else needed me to be." She looked up at him. "That's worth more than any amount of comfort or respectability." Cole kissed her, soft and deep, trying to pour into the gesture everything he didn't have words for. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "When they come, we face them together. You don't have to handle this alone." "I know. That's one of the things I love about you. You stand beside me, not in front of me." They spent the evening preparing for the inevitable visit, though there wasn't much to prepare. The cabin was clean, the sleeping arrangements obvious and proper, with Cole's bedroll spread in the main room and Evelyn's things in the loft they'd built last week. Everything was respectable by any reasonable standard, but Cole knew that wouldn't matter to people determined to find scandal. 2 days later, the delegation arrived. Cole spotted them from the north pasture where he was checking fence, 3 riders making their way down into the valley. He recognized Mrs. Henderson's sturdy form, Reverend Matthew's tall, thin silhouette, and trailing behind them, inevitably, Edward Lang. Cole rode back to warn Evelyn, but she'd already seen them from the cabin window. She was waiting on the porch when they arrived, her chin up, her hands clasped in front of her like a woman preparing for battle. "Mrs. Henderson, Reverend Matthews," she said politely as they dismounted. Then, with noticeably less warmth, "Mr. Lang." Mrs. Henderson was a round woman with kind eyes and an unfortunate tendency to believe gossip. She approached the porch with obvious discomfort, twisting her hands together. "Miss Hart, we've come to check on your welfare. There's been concern in town about your situation." "My situation is fine, Mrs. Henderson, but thank you for your concern." Reverend Matthews stepped forward. He was a circuit preacher who traveled between several small towns, a practical man who'd seen enough of frontier life to not be shocked by much. But even he looked troubled. "Miss Hart, I understand Mr. Archer has proposed marriage. Is this something you truly want, or do you feel obligated?" "I feel fortunate," Evelyn said clearly. "Cole Archer is the finest man I've ever met, and marrying him is absolutely what I want." "But you barely know him," Edward interjected. "You've been here, what, 3 weeks? That's hardly enough time to make such a permanent decision." "I knew you for 3 months through letters, Mr. Lang, and that turned out to be too long." Evelyn's voice was sharp. "At least with Cole, I know exactly who he is. He's never pretended to be anything other than what he is." Edward flinched. Mrs. Henderson looked between them, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. Perhaps we could speak with you privately, dear, she suggested. Without Mr. Archer present? Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Cole. Miss Hart, Evelyn, we're simply trying to ensure you're not being coerced. Reverend Matthews' voice was gentle. You've been through a difficult experience. It would be natural to feel grateful to someone who helped you, but gratitude isn't the same as love. You're right, Evelyn agreed. It's not. But what I feel for Cole isn't gratitude, it's love. And what's more, it's respect. He treats me like an equal partner, not like property or a charity case. Can any of you say the same about your marriages? The question hung in the air, pointed and uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed. The Reverend shifted his weight. The living arrangements are improper, Edward said, changing tactics. You're unmarried, living together. It's scandalous. Cole, who'd been standing silently near the corral, finally spoke. I sleep in the main room. Evelyn has the loft. We're not living together in the way you're implying, Lang, and you know it. You're just angry that she chose differently than you wanted. I'm trying to protect her reputation. Her reputation? Cole's laugh was harsh. You destroyed her reputation the moment you walked away from her at that station. Don't stand there now and pretend you care about it. That's enough, Reverend Matthews said firmly. He looked at Evelyn with searching eyes. Miss Hart, I need to ask you directly. If I agree to marry you and Mr. Archer, will I be performing a wedding you truly want, or one you feel forced into by circumstance? Evelyn met his gaze steadily. Reverend, I walked 1,000 miles in shoes that fell apart because I believed in a promise someone made me. That promise was broken, but along the way, I learned something important. I'm stronger than I thought I was. Strong enough to survive rejection, strong enough to start over, and strong enough to recognize real love when I find it. She reached for Cole's hand and he took it, their fingers intertwining. Marrying Cole isn't about circumstance or convenience. It's about choosing a partner who sees me for who I am and loves me anyway. If you perform our wedding, you'll be performing one of the most genuine ceremonies of your career. The Reverend studied them both for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. I believe you. I'll marry you if that's what you both want. It is, they said together. Mrs. Henderson looked relieved. Edward looked furious. He opened his mouth to protest, but Reverend Matthews held up a hand. Edward, enough. I've heard what I needed to hear. These two are adults making an informed choice. It's not our place to interfere further. But enough. The Reverend's voice was firm. You brought me here to assess the situation, and I have. Miss Hart is here of her own free will, and their marriage has my blessing. That should be the end of it. Edward stared at them all, his face cycling through emotions, anger, embarrassment, something that might have been genuine hurt. Finally, he turned and strode to his horse, mounting in one sharp motion. You're making a mistake, he said to Evelyn. Both of you. And when this falls apart, don't expect sympathy from me. He rode off without waiting for a response, his horse's hooves throwing up clods of dirt. The others watched him go with varying degrees of discomfort. I apologize for Edward, Mrs. Henderson said softly. He's been difficult since you arrived, Miss Hart. I think perhaps he's not handling rejection as well as a grown man should. That's not my problem anymore, Evelyn said. But her voice was gentler now, the anger draining away. Mrs. Henderson, Reverend Matthews, I appreciate you coming all this way. I truly do. It's good to know someone in town cares about my well-being, but I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. We do, the Reverend assured her. And we'll spread the word that this marriage has the church's blessing. That should quiet some of the gossip. After they left, Cole and Evelyn stood on the porch, watching the dust settle from the horse's departure. The confrontation had left them both wrung out, exhausted by the effort of defending something that should have needed no defense. Well, Cole said eventually, that went better than I expected. Really? Because that felt awful. Could have been worse. At least the Reverend's on our side now. That counts for something. He pulled her close. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I'm not. Evelyn leaned into him. I meant what I said, every word. And saying it out loud, making it official, that felt good. Like I was claiming this life instead of just stumbling into it. They went inside as the sun began to set, the valley filling with long shadows. Evelyn made dinner while Cole added wood to the stove, both of them moving in the synchronized way of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. The cabin felt warm and safe, a haven against the judgment and interference of the outside world. Later, after they'd eaten and cleaned up, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the cold. The stars were coming out, brilliant against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, the sound lonely and wild. "Cole," Evelyn said quietly, "what Edward said about me maybe regretting this. Are you worried about that?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not that you'll regret marrying me exactly, but that you'll regret the life, the isolation, the hardship. There's a lot of winter ahead of us, and it gets dark in more ways than one. Tell me about it. The worst of it. I want to know what I'm choosing." So Cole told her about winters when the snow piled so high you couldn't see out the windows, when the wind howled like demons and the cold crept through every crack in the walls. About months of the same food, the same four walls, the same silence broken only by the sound of your own breathing. About cabin fever that could drive people mad, about the way isolation could make small problems feel insurmountable. "Some years I don't see another soul from December to March," he said. "It's just me and the animals and the endless work of keeping everything alive. You read the same books over and over until you've memorized them. You talk to yourself because you forget what your own voice sounds like. And when spring finally comes, you feel like you've been locked in a cave for half your life." Evelyn was quiet, absorbing this. "That sounds hard." "It is. But you chose it anyway. Why?" Cole thought about how to explain it. "Because the hardship is honest. Because when you make it through a Montana winter, you know you've earned the spring. Because there's a purity to this life. You work, you survive, you build something real. No politics, no pretense, no having to be anyone other than exactly who you are." He looked at her. "But Evelyn, I chose this knowing I was alone. You don't have to. There are easier paths." "Maybe I don't want easier. Maybe I want real, even if real is hard." She squeezed his hand. "Besides, I won't be alone this winter. I'll have you. That changes everything." "Does it?" "Yes, because hardship shared is different than hardship borne alone. We'll keep each other sane. We'll remind each other why we chose this, and when spring comes, we'll have survived it together. That's worth something, isn't it?" Cole pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, soap and wood smoke, and something uniquely her. "It's worth everything." They sat until the cold drove them inside, until the fire was banked and the lamps turned down. Cole spread his bedroll in the main room while Evelyn climbed to the loft, the arrangement they'd maintained since that night he'd proposed. It was proper, respectable, everything a gentleman should do, but it was also becoming increasingly difficult. Cole lay in the darkness, listening to Evelyn moving around above him, hearing every creak of the floorboards, every soft sound she made, knowing she was so close but still impossibly far. "Cole?" Her voice drifted down from the loft. "Yeah?" "How long until the Reverend comes back through?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "Why?" "Just wondering how long we have to keep being proper." He heard the smile in her voice and felt an answering one spread across his own face. "Too long." "That's what I thought." She was quiet for a moment. "Good night, Cole." "Good night, Evelyn." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Cole worked from dawn to dusk, getting the ranch ready for winter, securing buildings, stocking firewood, making sure the cattle had access to water and shelter. Evelyn learned to shoot the rifle, to identify which plants could be foraged for winter greens, to preserve meat and vegetables in every way possible. They worked with the intensity of people who knew time was running short, who felt the cold creeping closer each day. But there was joy in it too, the satisfaction of building something together. Every task completed was a small victory, every skill Evelyn mastered another tool for their survival. Word spread through Red Willow that the wedding would happen soon, and the reactions were predictably mixed. Some folks sent small gifts, a jar of preserves, a bolt of cloth, a set of candles. Others sent nothing, their silence speaking volumes. Edward Lang made one more attempt to interfere, but Sheriff Wilson shut him down firmly, suggesting that perhaps Lang should focus on his own affairs rather than obsessing over Eveline's choices. On a cold Tuesday morning, Reverend Matthews arrived with Mrs. Henderson and her husband as witnesses. Cole had cleaned up as best he could, shaving carefully and wearing his Sunday shirt. Evelyn had spent the previous evening altering her gray dress, adding lace from the trunk, and taking in seams until it fit perfectly. When she came down from the loft that morning, Cole's breath caught. She was beautiful, not in the polished, artificial way of town women, but in a way that was real and raw and absolutely genuine. Her hair was pinned up simply, her face scrubbed clean, her eyes bright with nervous excitement. "You look perfect," he said. "So do you." They stood facing each other in the small cabin while Reverend Matthews opened his worn prayer book. Mrs. Henderson sniffled, already tearing up. Her husband stood awkwardly in the corner, clearly uncomfortable with emotion but gamely present. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, and Evelyn felt the words wash over her like a benediction. The ceremony was simple, traditional. The Reverend spoke about love and commitment, about choosing each other day after day, about building a life through work and faith and mutual support. When it came time for vows, Cole took both her hands in his calloused palms warm and steady. "I, Cole Archer, take you, Evelyn Hart, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand beside you in all things, to respect your strength and support your dreams, to be honest even when it's hard, and to love you for as long as I draw breath." Evelyn's voice shook only slightly as she responded. "I, Evelyn Hart, take you, Cole Archer, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to be your partner in all things, to work beside you and build this life together, to be brave when fear whispers, and to love you through every season." The Reverend smiled. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cole, you may kiss your bride." Cole cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Then he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Mrs. Henderson was openly crying, and even her stoic husband looked misty-eyed. "Congratulations," Reverend Matthews said, shaking Cole's hand and embracing Evelyn. "May God bless your union." They celebrated with coffee and the cake Mrs. Henderson had brought, the cabin filled with warm conversation and genuine good wishes. The Hendersons left before the afternoon grew too late, but the Reverend lingered, making sure the paperwork was properly filed, the marriage legally binding. "You're good people," he told them at the door. "Don't let anyone tell you different." After he left, Cole and Evelyn stood in the doorway watching the sun sink toward the western ridge. The temperature was dropping fast, and frost was already forming on the grass. Winter was coming, bringing with it all the challenges Cole had warned about. But Evelyn felt no fear. She felt ready. "So," Cole said eventually, "Mrs. Archer." "Mr. Archer, how does it feel to be married?" "Ask me in 50 years. He laughed, the sound warm and free. Then he swept her up in his arms, ignoring her surprised yelp, and carried her over the threshold. Inside, he set her down gently, his hands going to her waist, his forehead resting against hers. "I love you," he said. "I know I don't say it enough, but I do. More than I thought I could love anyone. I love you too." She pulled him down for another kiss, deeper this time, full of promise and possibility. "Now stop being so proper and kiss me like you mean it." So he did. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dancing in the lamplight spilling from the cabin windows. They would fall all night and into the next day, blanketing the valley in white, marking the end of one season and the beginning of another. Inside, two people who'd found each other through rejection and courage began their life together, building something that would last longer than any winter, stronger than any storm. The cabin was warm with fire and love, filled with the sound of laughter and quiet conversation, proof that sometimes the best things grew in the hardest soil. And in the meadow where Cole's mother's wildflowers slept beneath the gathering snow, the seeds of next spring's blooms waited patiently, knowing that winter was temporary, but what took root in the right place could last forever. The snow that had begun falling on their wedding night didn't stop for 3 days. By the time it finally let up, the valley was transformed into something from a dream, white and pristine and utterly silent except for the wind moving through the cottonwoods. Drifts piled high against the cabin walls, and the world beyond the ranch seemed to have disappeared entirely, leaving only this small pocket of warmth and life. Evelyn woke on the fourth morning to find Cole already up, stoking the fire to chase away the pre-dawn cold. She watched him from the bed they now shared, taking in the easy competence of his movements, the way the firelight played across his features. Her husband. The word still felt strange and wonderful in her mind. "You're staring," Cole said without turning around. "How did you know?" "I can feel it." He glanced over his shoulder, his smile soft. "Besides, you do it every morning." "Maybe I like what I see. Maybe I like being looked at." He came back to bed, the cabin still dark except for the growing fire. "How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in years." She curled into his warmth. "You?" "Same." He kissed her forehead. "But we need to get up. Cattle need checking, and this much snow means trouble." They dressed quickly in layers, preparing for the brutal cold. Evelyn had learned in the past weeks that winter work required careful preparation. Too few clothes and you'd freeze, too many and you'd sweat, which was even more dangerous. She pulled on the wool stockings Cole had bought her, the sturdy work dress, the heavy coat and boots. By the time she was ready, she looked nothing like the woman who'd stepped off that train in torn shoes and a stained traveling dress. Outside, the cold hit like a fist. Evelyn gasped, her breath forming clouds in the air. The temperature had dropped well below freezing during the night, and the sky was that particular shade of pale blue that promised no relief, no warming sun, just endless cold. "Stay close," Cole warned. "Snow's deeper than it looks, and I don't want you falling in a drift." They made their way to the barn, checking on Rusty and the milk cow first. Both animals were fine, warm enough in their shelter with plenty of hay. Then came the harder work, following the fence line to find the cattle, making sure none had gotten stuck in the deep snow or wandered too far looking for forage. It took hours. The cattle had bunched together in a natural windbreak formed by a stand of trees and a low ridge, their body heat creating a pocket of relative warmth. Cole counted heads while Evelyn broke ice on the creek so they could drink. Her hands ached with cold despite her gloves, and her face felt numb where the wind hit it. "All accounted for," Cole said finally. "Let's get back." The return trip was harder, fighting wind that had picked up and blown snow into their faces. Evelyn's legs burned with effort, each step requiring concentration and strength. By the time they reached the cabin, she was exhausted, every muscle trembling. Inside, Cole helped her out of her frozen outer layers and settled her by the fire. He made coffee while sensation slowly returned to her fingers and toes in painful prickles. "That was brutal," she said when she could finally speak without her teeth chattering. "That was easy." Cole handed her a cup. "Wait until we have to do it in a blizzard when you can't see 3 feet in front of you and the wind's trying to knock you down." "You're very encouraging." "I'm being honest." But his eyes were warm. "You did good out there. Didn't complain, kept up, did what needed doing. Most city women would have quit before we reached the tree line. Most city women wouldn't have married a rancher in the first place." "Lucky me, then." They spent the rest of the day inside, doing the small tasks that kept them occupied during winter. Evelyn mended clothes while Cole repaired tack and sharpened tools. They made bread together, working the dough side by side at the small table. They talked about everything and nothing. Memories from childhood, dreams for the future, the mundane details of daily life. It was in these quiet moments that Evelyn understood what Cole had meant about winter isolation. The world outside was vast and empty, but inside this cabin, they'd created something small and precious. A partnership built on respect and work, and the kind of love that grew slowly, putting down deep roots. As evening fell and they prepared dinner, Cole suddenly stopped what he was doing and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "I keep thinking about that day at the train station, how close I came to not walking over to you. I almost didn't, you know. Almost convinced myself it wasn't my business, that you'd figure something out on your own." Evelyn set down the knife she'd been using to cut vegetables. "What changed your mind?" "I saw you crying, saw how you'd bent over like you were trying to make yourself smaller, invisible. And I thought about Sarah, my sister, and how she must have looked that day in Denver when her miner walked away. He shook his head. I couldn't let it happen again, couldn't live with myself if I just stood there and did nothing. So you saved me? No. His voice was firm. You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to land while you figured things out. Everything else, the strength, the courage, the choice to stay and build this life, that was all you. Evelyn felt tears prickling her eyes. We saved each other then, because I think you were lonely out here, even if you wouldn't admit it. And I think having someone to share this with has changed things for you too. Cole crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. Changed everything, he murmured into her hair. I didn't even know how lonely I was until you were here. Didn't know what I was missing. They held each other as the wind picked up outside, as the temperature dropped and the world grew dark. This was what marriage was, Evelyn thought, not the ceremony or the paperwork or even the physical intimacy, though that was wonderful. It was this, two people choosing each other every single day, building something strong enough to withstand whatever came. The winter deepened as November gave way to December. More snow fell, and the cold settled in with a permanence that made autumn feel like a distant dream. They fell into rhythms that would sustain them through the long months ahead, morning chores, afternoon tasks, evening hours by the fire. Some days were harder than others, when the cold seemed to seep into your bones and stay there, when the sameness felt oppressive. But there were good days too. Days when the sun came out and turned the snow into a field of diamonds, days when they rode out together to check the cattle and came back laughing, their faces red with cold but their spirits high. Days when they stayed in bed late, wrapped in quilts and each other, letting the work wait while they simply enjoyed being together. One particularly cold evening in mid-December, as they sat by the fire reading, Evelyn set down her book and looked at Cole thoughtfully. Do you ever wonder what Edward Lang is doing right now? Cole glanced up, surprised by the question. Not really. Why? I don't know. I was just thinking about how different my life would be if he'd claimed me that day. If he'd looked past the torn shoes and kept his promise. You regret that he didn't? No, God, no. She shook her head emphatically. I'm grateful he showed his true colors before I was trapped. But I wonder sometimes what he tells himself, how he justifies what he did. Cole considered this. Men like Edward Lang don't think they need justification. They believe their comfort, their preferences, their image. All of that matters more than keeping promises to people they consider beneath them. He probably thinks he did you a favor by not saddling you with a marriage to someone who didn't really want you. That's sad. It's the truth. Cole set his own book aside. But Evelyn, you should know. I heard he left town. She sat up straighter. What? When? About a week after the wedding. Mr. Henderson mentioned it last time I was in for supplies. Apparently Edward requested a transfer to the bank's office in Helena. Said Red Willow was too small for his ambitions. More likely too small to escape the gossip. Probably. Cole smiled slightly. Henderson said folks were actually relieved. Turns out Lang wasn't nearly as well-liked as he thought he was. Too pompous, too quick to look down on people. Once he left, the whole town seemed to relax. Evelyn absorbed this news, surprised by how little she felt. No triumph, no vindication, just a distant sense of closure. Edward Lang had been such a large figure in her story, the promise that brought her west, the rejection that changed everything. But now he was just a footnote, a wrong turn that had led to the right path. I hope he finds what he's looking for, she said finally. Whatever that is. That's generous of you. It's honest. I don't wish him ill. I just don't wish him anything at all anymore. He's not part of our story. No, Cole agreed. He's not. They returned to their reading, but after a while Cole spoke again. There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. Been waiting for the right time. Evelyn looked up, sensing the seriousness in his tone. What is it? This spring, I'm thinking about expanding the herd. There's good grazing land to the east that I've had my eye on for years. If we could increase our cattle by even a third, we'd have a real operation here. Enough to maybe hire help during busy seasons. Enough to build a proper barn, maybe even add on to the cabin. That sounds wonderful. What's the problem? The problem is it'll take most of our savings to buy the additional cattle. And it's a risk. More animals means more work, more things that can go wrong. If we have a bad year, we could lose everything. He met her eyes. I won't make that decision without you. This is your ranch now, too, your future. You deserve a say. Evelyn felt something warm spread through her chest. This was what partnership meant. Being trusted with the hard decisions, having her opinion valued not because she was a wife, but because she was an equal. What do you think we should do? She asked. I think we take the risk. We're young enough to recover if things go wrong, and I think the potential reward is worth it. But I need to know you're comfortable with the uncertainty. She thought about it, really thought about it. A year ago, she would have been terrified of risk, would have chosen safety and security above all else. But that Evelyn had been shaped by scarcity, by the constant fear of losing what little she had. This Evelyn knew she was stronger than that. Let's do it, she said. Let's build something bigger. Cole's smile was brilliant. You're sure? I'm sure. We didn't come this far by playing it safe. He crossed to her chair and pulled her up, kissing her thoroughly. Have I told you lately that I love you? Not in the last hour. Well, I do, more every day. I love you too. She rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. We're going to be fine, Cole. Whatever comes, we'll handle it together. Christmas came quietly to the valley. They had no decorations, no gifts wrapped in fancy paper, no elaborate feast. But on Christmas morning, Evelyn woke to find that Cole had gone out before dawn and cut a small pine tree, setting it up in the corner of the cabin. He'd strung it with paper chains he'd made in secret, and at its base sat a small package wrapped in cloth. Cole, she breathed, when did you do this? Been working on it for a week. Had to hide the paper chains in the barn. He looked almost shy. I know it's not much. It's perfect. She threw her arms around him. It's absolutely perfect. Her gift to him was a new shirt she'd sewn from fabric she'd bought secretly during one of their supply runs, using a pattern she'd modified to fit his broad shoulders. When he tried it on, the fit was flawless. How did you get my measurements without me noticing? He asked, amazed. I'm very sneaky. She smiled. Do you like it? I love it. It's the nicest shirt I've ever owned. They spent Christmas Day together in the warm cabin, cooking a special dinner from their carefully hoarded supplies. Evelyn made a dried apple pie that was more crust than filling but tasted like heaven. Cole told stories about Christmases growing up in Texas, and Evelyn shared memories of her parents, keeping their spirits alive through remembrance. As evening fell and they sat by the fire, Cole pulled out his mother's old Bible and read the Christmas story aloud. His voice was steady and warm, and Evelyn thought about Mary making that long journey while pregnant, about finding shelter in a stable, about building a life in the most unlikely circumstances. Maybe every generation had its own version of that story, people finding home in unexpected places, making families from hope and determination. What are you thinking about? Cole asked when he finished reading. About how far we've both come, about how neither of us could have predicted this. Regrets? Not a single one. January and February were the hardest months. The cold was relentless, the work exhausting, the isolation sometimes overwhelming. There were days when Evelyn felt like the cabin walls were closing in, when she craved conversation with anyone other than Cole, when she missed the simple luxury of seeing another human face. But there were also moments of profound beauty, nights when the northern lights painted the sky in greens and purples that seemed impossible, mornings when the sunrise turned the snow pink and gold, afternoons when they'd finished their work and Cole would play the harmonica he'd pulled from his trunk, filling the cabin with music that chased away the winter darkness. They learned each other during those long months, learned that Cole was grumpy before his first cup of coffee, but tender when he thought Evelyn wasn't looking, learned that Evelyn talked in her sleep and hoarded candles because she hated running out of light, learned how to fight fairly, how to apologize genuinely, how to forgive quickly. One bitter February night, they had their first real argument. It started over something small. Cole wanted to check the cattle even though a storm was building, and Evelyn thought it was too dangerous. But it escalated into something bigger, all the small frustrations and fears they'd been holding back spilling out. You don't always have to protect me, Evelyn shouted. I'm not made of glass. I'm not trying to protect you. I'm trying to keep you alive, Cole shot back. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you still see me as that helpless woman from the train platform. That's not fair, isn't it? You make all the decisions about what's too dangerous, what's too hard, what I can and can't handle. Did it ever occur to you that I might want to say in my own life? Cole stared at her, his jaw working, then quietly, "You're right." The fight went out of Evelyn like air from a punctured balloon. "What?" "You're right. I have been making decisions without consulting you, and that's not fair. I'm sorry." He ran his hand through his hair, that gesture of frustration and uncertainty. "It's just, the thought of something happening to you terrifies me, and I know that's not your problem to manage, but there it is." Evelyn felt her anger transforming into something softer. "I'm scared too, Cole. Scared of losing you, scared of making mistakes, scared I'm not strong enough for this life. But I can't live in fear, and you can't make all your choices based on protecting me. We have to trust each other." "I know." He crossed to her, taking her hands. "I'm sorry. I'll do better." "I'm sorry too, for yelling. You had a right to yell." He pulled her close. "We're going to fight sometimes. That's normal. But as long as we keep talking, keep being honest, we'll be okay." They made up thoroughly, and the next morning Cole asked her opinion before making any decisions. It was a small change, but it mattered. It meant he'd heard her, that he was willing to adjust, that their partnership was real and evolving. March arrived with the first hints of warming, though snow still covered the ground and the nights were frigid. But the days grew longer, and there was a feeling in the air of something ending, something beginning. The cattle grew restless, sensing the change in seasons. The horses were friskier during morning chores. And one morning in late March, Evelyn woke feeling different. Not sick exactly, but aware of her body in a new way. She said nothing to Cole, waiting to be sure, but by the end of the week she knew. She was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with a mixture of joy and terror. A baby. Their baby. A new life to protect and raise and love. In this harsh place, in this difficult life? Could they do it? Could she? She told Cole on a Sunday morning when they were still in bed and the world felt soft and possible. He'd been half asleep, his arm draped across her waist, when she whispered the words, "Cole, I think I'm pregnant." He went completely still. Then he sat up, staring at her in the growing light. "You think? Or you know?" "I'm pretty sure." A slow smile spread across his face, transforming him. "We're having a baby?" "Looks like it." He let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile radius, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her senseless. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying, he kept saying the same thing over and over. "We're having a baby. We're having a baby." "Are you happy?" Evelyn asked, though she could see that he was. "Happy? Evelyn, I don't even have words." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach, his expression awed. "A baby. Our baby. It's going to be hard. Raising a child out here. Everything worth doing is hard, but then..." He kissed her forehead. "We'll manage. We always do." As winter finally loosened its grip and spring began to assert itself, life at the ranch shifted into a new gear. Cole expanded the herd as planned, buying cattle from a rancher 3 valleys over. The work tripled overnight, but they managed it together. Evelyn, despite the early stages of pregnancy, insisted on doing her share. Cole learned to let her, though she caught him watching her constantly, ready to jump in if she showed any signs of struggling. The cattle thrived on the spring grass, growing fat and healthy. Cole's gamble was paying off. By May, when the wildflowers in his mother's meadow began to bloom again, he and Evelyn rode out together to see them. The display was spectacular, purples and yellows and reds painting the landscape like someone had spilled a jar of jewels. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Evelyn said, watching the flowers dance in the breeze, "of what you've built here." "She'd be proud of both of us." Cole helped her dismount, his hand lingering on her waist where the first small swell of pregnancy was beginning to show. "And she would have loved you." They walked among the flowers, and Evelyn thought about cycles, of seasons, of life, of pain transforming into growth. A year ago, she'd been desperate and alone, her shoes torn, her dreams shattered. Now she was here, married to a good man, carrying his child, building a life that mattered. "We should bring the baby here," she said, "when he or she is old enough. Teach them about your mother, about how these flowers keep coming back no matter how hard the winter was." "That's a good lesson." Cole plucked a columbine and tucked it behind her ear. "Resilience. That's what this place teaches. That's what you taught me." "I taught you. You walked 1,000 miles in shoes that fell apart. If that's not resilience, I don't know what is." In June, they had visitors. Not hostile ones this time, but neighbors from a ranch 15 miles south. The Williams family, husband, wife, and 3 young children, had heard about Cole's expanded operation and came to trade knowledge and offer friendship. It was the first time Evelyn had spoken to another woman since Mrs. Henderson's visit months ago, and the conversation flowed like water after a drought. "It gets easier," Mrs. Williams assured her when she learned about the pregnancy. "The isolation, I mean. You get used to it, and having a child helps, gives you purpose beyond just surviving." "Does it ever feel like too much?" "Every winter." Mrs. Williams laughed. "But then spring comes, and you remember why you chose this life, and you look at what you've built, and you think, we did this. We made something real out of nothing." The Williams family left with promises to visit again, to help during calving season, to be the kind of neighbors that frontier life demanded. Far apart, but there when needed. That night, as Cole and Evelyn prepared for bed, she felt more settled than she had in months. "We're not alone out here," she said. "Not really." "No," Cole agreed. "We're not." Summer passed in a blur of work and growth. Evelyn's belly swelled with the baby, and the ranch thrived under their combined efforts. They hired a hand for the harvest season, a young man named Thomas who worked hard and asked no questions about their unconventional beginning. The expanded herd meant more beef to sell, and when Cole rode into Red Willow to make arrangements with the buyer, he came back with news. "Town's different now," he said, unpacking supplies. "People were friendlier. Asked about you, about the baby. Mrs. Henderson sent a baby blanket she knitted." "Really?" Evelyn took the soft blue blanket, touched by the gesture. "I think once Edward left, people felt free to make up their own minds about us. And turns out most of them think we're doing just fine." "We are doing fine," Evelyn said. "Better than fine." As autumn painted the valley in golds and reds, Evelyn's time grew near. They'd made arrangements with a midwife from a ranch 20 miles north, a tough old woman named Mrs. Callahan, who delivered half the babies in the territory. When the pains started on a crisp October morning, Cole rode like the devil to fetch her. The labor was long and hard, testing Evelyn's strength in ways she'd never imagined. But Mrs. Callahan was competent and encouraging, and Cole held her hand through every contraction, his face pale but determined. "You can do this," he kept saying. "You're the strongest person I know." When their daughter finally arrived, screaming her fury at the world, Evelyn held her and wept with relief and joy and exhaustion. Cole's face was wet with tears as he touched the baby's tiny hand, watched her fingers curl around his. "She's perfect," he breathed. "She's absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Evelyn asked. Cole looked at the baby, then at Evelyn, then out the window at the valley where his mother's flowers grew. "Rose," he said. "After my mother, Rose Margaret Archer." "Rose," Evelyn repeated, testing the name. "Hello, Rose. Welcome to your home." The baby settled into their lives with surprising ease. She was a good baby, as frontier babies had to be, adaptable and hardy, crying when she needed something but content to sleep in her cradle while her parents worked. Evelyn learned to nurse while mending, to soothe a fussy baby while cooking dinner, to function on broken sleep and pure determination. Cole was a revelation as a father. He'd been worried he wouldn't know what to do, but he took to it naturally. He'd walk Rose around the cabin at night when she was fussy, singing old trail songs in a voice rough but tender. He'd talk to her constantly while doing chores, narrating his work like she could understand. "See that, Rose? That's how you mend a fence. See, someday you'll do this yourself, probably better than your old man." As winter approached again, Evelyn found herself thinking about cycles and stories. A year and a half ago, she'd stepped off that train with nothing but torn shoes and broken dreams. Now she had everything: a home, a husband, a daughter, a life built on honest work and genuine love. One evening in late November, as snow began to fall again and Rose slept in her cradle, Cole pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. "What are you doing?" Evelyn asked. "Writing to Sarah, my sister. Haven't written in a while, and I want to tell her about Rose." He paused, thinking. "Want to tell her about you too? About how you came here with torn shoes and stayed to build something beautiful." Evelyn watched him write, his letters careful and precise. When he finished, he read it aloud to her, and she heard herself described as brave, strong, resilient, all the things she'd never thought she was, but had somehow become. "Is that really how you see me?" she asked when he finished. "That's exactly how I see you." He set the letter aside. "Evelyn, you walked 1,000 miles to get here. You survived rejection and gossip and the hardest winter Montana could throw at you. You learned a completely new life and made it your own. You gave birth to our daughter in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. What part of that isn't brave?" She thought about it, really thought about it. The woman who'd arrived on that train platform would have said none of it was brave, that it was just survival, just doing what had to be done. But this woman, the one she'd become, understood that survival itself was an act of courage. "I guess you're right," she said finally. "I know I am." He pulled her close, careful not to wake the baby. "And I'm grateful every single day that Edward Lang was fool enough to walk away from you, because his loss was my gain, and I got the best deal of my life." Smooth talker. Just honest. He kissed her temple. "That's what we have, Evelyn. Honesty and partnership and love. That's more than most people ever find." As winter deepened and the world outside grew cold and dark, the cabin remained warm and bright. They survived that second winter easier than the first, knowing what to expect, having weathered it once before. Rose grew and changed daily, her eyes focusing, her hands reaching, her voice finding new sounds. And when spring came again, when the snow melted and the creek ran high and the wildflowers bloomed in the meadow, Evelyn and Cole stood together watching their daughter take her first wobbling steps across the cabin floor. She walked 3 steps before falling onto her well-padded bottom, then looked up at them with such surprise and pride that they both laughed. "She's going to be a handful," Cole predicted. "She's going to be amazing," Evelyn corrected. They were both right. Years passed, marked by the turning of seasons and the growth of their family. Rose was joined by a brother 2 years later, then another sister. The ranch prospered, Cole's gamble on expansion paying off beyond their wildest expectations. They built a new barn, added 2 rooms to the cabin, hired permanent help. The Williams family became close friends, and other families settled nearby, forming the beginnings of a real community. Edward Lang's name was rarely mentioned, though they heard occasionally through the territorial grapevine that he'd married well in Helena, a banker's daughter with the proper pedigree and wardrobe. Evelyn wished him well and meant it. His rejection had been the greatest gift he could have given her, though he'd never understand that. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Cole and Evelyn would sit on the porch they'd expanded and watch the sunset over the valley. They'd talk about the early days, about how far they'd come, about plans for the future. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Cole asked one such evening. "About what would have happened if I hadn't walked over?" "Sometimes," Evelyn admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. That's not the life we got." "What life did we get?" She looked at him. This man who'd seen worth where others saw failure, who'd offered partnership instead of charity, who'd loved her not despite her torn shoes, but because of what those shoes represented. She looked at their children playing in the yard, at the ranch they'd built together, at the life they'd carved from raw possibility. "We got the real one," she said simply. "Not the easy one, not the respectable one, but the real one. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." Cole took her hands, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "Neither would I." As the sun sank below the western ridge, painting the sky in colors that still took her breath away, after all these years, Evelyn thought about stories and how they end. Not with grand gestures or dramatic resolutions, but with quiet moments of contentment, with children laughing and cattle grazing and wildflowers blooming in a meadow where a mother's love had planted them decades ago. She thought about torn shoes and the miles they'd carried her, about train platforms and cruel rejections and desperate tears, about a cowboy who'd looked at her poverty and seen strength instead of shame, about building a life one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. And she thought about how sometimes the best stories don't begin with once upon a time, but with the bride arrived with torn shoes. Because those shoes had brought her here, to this valley, to this man, to this life that was hard and beautiful and absolutely, completely real. "Cole?" she said, as the stars began to appear overhead. "Yeah? Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing past the shoes." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you for being worth seeing." Inside, Rose called out that dinner was ready, her voice carrying through the evening air with the confidence of a child who'd never known rejection, who'd been raised on love and honest work and the kind of security that came from knowing you were wanted. Behind her, her siblings chattered and argued and laughed, the sounds of a full house, a full life. Evelyn and Cole stood together for one more moment, looking out at the valley that had become theirs in every way that mattered. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges: cattle to tend, fences to mend, children to raise, a future to build. But tonight, this moment, was perfect in its simplicity. They'd started with nothing but torn shoes and desperate hope. They'd built something that would last for generations. Not just a ranch, but a legacy of resilience and courage and the kind of love that grew stronger through hardship rather than weaker. The wildflowers in the meadow would bloom again next spring, and the spring after that, and the spring after that. The cattle would calve, the crops would grow, the children would thrive. And two people who'd found each other through rejection would continue to choose each other day after day, year after year, for as long as they both drew breath. Because that was what love looked like in this hard, beautiful place. Not fairy tales or false promises, but partnership forged in the fires of survival. Not easy, but real. Not perfect, but true. Not what either of them had planned, but exactly what they both needed. The story that began with torn shoes on a dusty train platform had become a story about home. About finding it, building it, defending it, and filling it with love that was strong enough to last forever. And as Evelyn and Cole finally turned to go inside to join their children for dinner and the comfortable chaos of family life, the Montana sky spread above them like a blessing, vast and eternal and full of stars. The end, and also the beginning. Because every ending was just another beginning in disguise. Every closed door another opening if you had the courage to walk through it. And Evelyn Hart Archer had walked through enough doors, traveled enough miles, and worn enough shoes to tatters to know that sometimes the worst rejections led to the best destinations. She'd brought everything that mattered, after all, just like Cole had told her on that first day. Everything that mattered had been there in those torn shoes, the courage to keep walking, the strength to survive, the hope to begin again. Everything else had simply followed from that. And that, more than anything, was a story worth telling, a story worth living. A story that would echo through the valley long after the principals had passed, carried forward in children and grandchildren who would hear about the bride with torn shoes and the cowboy who saw not her poverty, but her strength, who would learn that sometimes love begins not with grand gestures, but with simple kindness, that sometimes home is not where you start, but where you choose to stay, that sometimes the best things in life come wrapped in the hardest packages. The cabin door closed behind them, shutting out the cold and sealing in the warmth. And in the meadow, a mile away, wildflowers dreamed beneath the earth, waiting for spring, knowing that patience and persistence would bring them back to life again and again, forever blooming in the place where they'd chosen to take root. Just like love, just like home, just like two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something that would last beyond memory, beyond time, beyond everything except the land itself, eternal and unforgiving and absolutely worth every step of the journey.